Hey, May 40 here. So I went to bed about 8:30 last night, and I was feeling great. The UCLA Bruins, all right? I was at UCLA for 1 year, but I will forever be a Bruin. UCLA Bruins football team looked like the worst Division I football team in the nation, and they shocked perhaps the best or one of the best football teams in the nation on Saturday, Penn State. I think they won 42-37. So the Bruins were 0-4 going into that game. And then out of nowhere, right, they produced this stunning victory. And one of the things that's amazing about it is that they just got a new offensive play caller only on Tuesday. And his name's Jerry Neuheisel, and he's the son of the former college football coach Rick Neuheisel, who was in the studio for CBS Sports during the game. And so Jerry Neuheisel was a backup quarterback for UCLA, and he came off the bench during his playing days to lead the Bruins to an upset victory of the then number 7 ranked Texans, about 8 years ago. And now, only on Tuesday, he's elected play caller. He's facing a top 10 opponent, and he dialed up an offensive plan that produced points in each of the Bruins' first 5 drives. It was just a stunning 42-37 victory over Penn State. Penn State was approximately a 27-point favorite going into this game. And during the broadcast, you would see Rick Neuheisel, the studio commentator for CBS, just so filled with pride and joy for his son. And you think, wow, with this much success, maybe Jerry Neuheisel will be the next offensive coordinator for the Bruins. Maybe he'll be the next head coach. And Rick Neuheisel was the coach of the Washington Huskies football team that finished number 3 in the nation in year 2000. Why should you care, particularly if you don't care about sports? Well, there was a terrific 2010 book on this team that was called Scoreboard Baby, a story of college football crime and complicity. And in short, most of the starters on this highly successful team were thugs who got away with an abundant amount of thuggish behavior, including rape. So you had 24 players on this team who were arrested or charged with crimes during their time at the university, crimes for which they did little or no time, because university officials, team coaches, local police and prosecutors, members of the media, even victims, all in the name of sustaining a winning program, kept quiet. And many of these crimes were absolutely egregious, right? Rape, battery, shooting. And so the easiest way to win in college football and in much of life is to have the lowest standards possible. And I wish that wasn't true, but we had a story in the news in the Los Angeles Times this week about a settlement policy by the County of Los Angeles for purported victims of sexual abuse, but they're not screening these victims. And so purported victims are incentivized to make up stories to tap into an automatic $50,000, $150,000 payout. And if you don't rigorously police the paying out of money, right, all sorts of people are going to come along to try to take advantage, because we are wired to pursue those things which are in our evolutionary advantage. And if you got something that'll help people pass on their genes, then they're very likely to do it. To the extent that I'm an intellectual, all right, I'm an intellectual gigolo in that I keep falling in love with one new idea after another. And I love ideas because I'm not normal. I didn't develop normally, in part because I grew up in foster care. My mother died when I was young. And so I've lived much of my life in a fantasy world, in an abstract world where I play with ideas and I imagine that I'm this brave, important truth teller. I woke up at 12:50 a.m. this morning, eager to do this show. And I kept myself in bed. I said, 40, wait until at least 2 a.m. before you get up to do the show. Now, it's maladaptive not to get enough sleep before you do your big weekly show, because no matter how much caffeine I consume, right, the voice does not lie. The voice is one of the most reliable indicators of what's going on with a person, and lack of sleep will show up very quickly in the voice. But I was just so excited that I finally got up at 2:44 this morning to talk about these things. And so when you live in an abstract world, and we all naturally gravitate towards those worlds that are most hospitable to our particular set of talents, and we all naturally have a tendency towards differentiation. We want to make ourselves essential to our group, to our employer, to our spouse, to our friends, because that is about the most secure posture for a life, right? If you make yourself as close to essential as possible by particularly developing your skills so that you're just so much better than other people at particular things, right? It's a pretty good strategy to go through life. So I love living in a world of ideas, and I'm not married, don't have kids, I don't have a normal set of responsibilities to distract myself from dwelling in a world of ideas. But this also comes with many dangerous weaknesses because I don't have a spouse and kids. I can live too much in this abstract world and get disconnected from reality. And many ideas that sound great, they don't turn out to be great in reality. They just sound good. All right, Commentary Magazine podcast. While I get some water.
If you attack us on Yom Kippur, you attack us on Sukkot, you attack us. And of course, the Yom Kippur War was in 1973 was an attack. The attacks of October 7th took place on Simchat Torah, the end of Sukkot. And so that's a very key signal that what is being attacked is Judaism at its root, and not the existence of a country that has been there now for 78 years, 77 years. So that is something to be put in mind as we hear now key signal, the sorts of things that I don't even know, I want to highlight this exactly, but sort of because I don't want to play this game of giving Tucker Carlson's controversy oxygen, but went on social media in the last day or two to suggest that Israel was behind the promotion of anti-Semitic tweets and social media posts in order to.
So I was talking about myself as an intellectual gigolo. So there may not be a lot of beliefs that I've held for a long time because I tend to be an enthusiast. So I'm not the most reliable bloke around because I'm always enthusiastic about something, but it's rarely the same thing. But I think one of my longest strongly held beliefs is that you can't make a better world, a better community, better society, or a better person until you arrive at a realistic understanding of what is true. And I think I heard Dennis Prager phrase it that way in the fall of 1988 on KBC radio. So I was about 22 years of age at the time. I was studying economics at UCLA, and I haven't differed from that belief. All right, we have to look truth in the face and be open and honest about the selfish and self-seeking component of human nature if we're going to make any difference in the world. And I love this framing, right? John Podhoretz, this was an attack on Judaism. So just as Christians love Jesus, Jews love Judaism, right? To the extent that Jews affiliate and associate with Judaism, they love their Judaism. And so every group wants to frame things in the most advantageous way possible. So you heard the saying, never let a crisis go to waste. There was a Democratic politician who used that during the global financial crash in 2008. Never let a crisis go to waste. And people do this, right? Women use sex, for example, or whatever is most powerful to try to control people. We all tend to try to shape the niche around us to our own advantage, and we all try to take advantage of crises and change in circumstance, and we all love to frame things that are the most flattering way possible. So instead of understanding, say, terror attacks against Jews as this is a power struggle, and we have different groups with different interests, and in the construction, maintenance, and protection of the Jewish state, right, often there were non-Jews who paid a significant price, and that which is good for Jews is sometimes not so good for some groups of non-Jews. That which is good for Palestinians or for Arabs or Muslims is sometimes not good for Jews and Christians, that different groups often have different interests. This is not inspiring. And so it is much more pleasing to frame attacks on your group as attacks on God, attacks on any notion of decency or the transcendent.
accelerate support against people that Israel is playing a role in, what do they call that on social media, in sort of pushing anti-Semitic posts, which is a new form of, to say that this is now adding a kind of epilogue or new afterword to the protocols of the Elders of Zion is to understate the case. And this guy has the third largest podcast in the United States.
Is he saying that?
Okay, the number of viewers is not necessarily a good metric on how important or influential a podcast is, right? Tucker Carlson has increasingly gone down market. Donald Trump took the Republican Party down market. There's nothing inherently wrong or right with going down market, but there are consequences when you go down market. And so Tucker Carlson increasingly appeals to a lower IQ audience, just as Donald Trump took the Republican Party down market to expand its base. One thing about those with fewer IQ points is that they are less capable and they are less influential in the real world. So that it's the number 3 podcast in the world, not necessarily that important when your listenership is primarily people who aren't very smart.
Something like that.
Is he saying that he's backed by Israel? Because that's what it sounds like when you say, oh, the anti-Semitism on social media is really, an Israeli op. It sounds like they're saying Israel is funding Tucker Carlson, because I don't know how many people are adding more than Tucker Carlson to the anti-Semitism on social media.
So we're almost 2 years since October 7th, and the story is that the world, in the face of an unprovoked attack on Jews that murdered more than 1,000 and injured almost 4,000, that attack was.
So I know a lot of Orthodox Jews who are from Australia, and one thing that I've noticed is that virtually everyone who I know well is happier in the United States, because the United States is a much more pluralistic nation than Australia. Australia has one dominant culture, and if you stand out from it, you will pay a significant price. And I have a lot of sympathies towards one dominant culture in a nation. I think overall a nation is better off with one dominant culture, but I have to be honest, this comes at a significant price to those who choose or who are not included in that dominant culture. So in Australia, there's one dominant culture. And so if you stand out apart from that one dominant culture, for example, you dress as an Orthodox Jew, you're distinctive as an Orthodox Jew, you're much more likely to get verbally abused and even physically attacked than in the United States, where the country is much more pluralistic. On the other hand, one dominant culture creates much more cohesion and social trust and improved quality of life for the majority. So that which is good for Jews or for gays or for blacks or for Mexicans or for any minority group is not necessarily that which is best for the majority culture, and that which is best for the majority culture is not necessarily best for the minority group. And so it's always tempting to frame things in terms of what is best for my group. That is the transcendent, universal, God-given best for all of humanity. Not necessarily true. So I pretty much worn a yarmulke most places I've gone for the last 25 years. And whenever Israel's at war, I get a lot more pushback. I get a lot more hostility. I get yelled at a lot more. So there are many advantages for Jews having their own state. But with every advantage, there comes a disadvantage. And one of the disadvantages for Jews of having their own state is that whatever that state does then reflects on Jews all around the world, even if those particular Jews don't agree with the particular policies carried out by the Jewish state. So we all love the advantages of things, and we all hate the disadvantages that come with those advantages. And so you can frame this Islamic terror attack in Manchester, England, as an attack on Judaism. Also, Yom Kippur is a day when the attacker had a pretty good understanding that there'd be a lot of Jews around, and they would produce more juicy targets for him. And so you can see things in terms of power politics. You can romanticize things. You can see things through the lens of faith. And maybe there are multiple truths here.
Was an accelerant to the hatred of Jews. That's the key here, that everybody in the world who cares about Jews or Jews ourselves have to reckon with.
So the way I viewed life changed when I converted to Judaism. So prior to my taking up Judaism, I never thought about, could a Holocaust happen in the United States? But as conversion to Judaism became more and more real to me, right, that possibility became something that I thought about and talked about. You see the world differently when you become a member of a minority group as opposed to being part of the, say, Christian majority. And starting in the 1960s, it became increasingly acceptable for various minority groups to publicly put their group first before the interests of the nation state. And I think that is quite ill-advised for a nation state. So I don't begrudge members of a minority group putting their minority group before the interests of the nation state, but it should be socially unacceptable to say it in public, just as it should be socially unacceptable to celebrate an assassination such as the assassination of Charlie Kirk. If you are a true believing person on the left, I would understand why you would feel some positive emotions at the assassination of one of your biggest enemies, Charlie Kirk. But you should have the social sense, and it should be socially enforced, that you do not publicly celebrate an assassination of a fellow citizen, someone who was just speaking out on a college tour. Right? It's ill-advised to celebrate that, and it's probably for the good of society that people pay some price for engaging in that socially maladaptive behavior. Similarly, this Islamic attacker in Manchester, England, his first name was Jihad. It should be socially unacceptable in England to be named Jihad. And his father was a doctor who publicly praised the October 7 terror attack of Hamas. So in a sane society, right, it should be socially unacceptable to praise a terror attack, just like it should be socially unacceptable to say, if you're on the pro-Israel side, oh, I'm so glad that X number of Palestinians died. Right? This celebration of slaughter, right, in a sane, healthy society should be socially unacceptable, even if you feel things that are joyous about the death of your enemies. Most normal, natural thing in the world is to feel all sorts of things that should be completely socially unacceptable. So we can create a much better world if we structure incentives to discourage people from, for example, taking on the name jihad, naming your kids jihad, or publicly celebrating any kind of assassination or terror attack. And so if we had a more cohesive, united society, that would be completely unacceptable. And so even if it comes with some costs to me and to my group, that we move towards a more unified, cohesive society, I think it is for the best. And in certain circumstances, or for example, if I lived in France, I would not walk around with a yarmulke on my head because it's socially unacceptable to do that in France. And I would think twice about walking around with a yarmulke on my head in Australia, in big cities, particularly after October 7. And wearing a yarmulke, it's not a divine commandment. It's much more of a practice. So I don't think it's the biggest deal if one abstains from that. And I should have empathy for non-Jews and for the number of non-Jews who find it bewildering and aggressive when, say, someone gets into their Uber who's wearing a yarmulke, or they're hiring or firing or interacting with a complete stranger in a public space, and someone is wearing a yarmulke. That is a person who's saying, I glorify something that is different. I desire to be different. And we all have a natural tendency to have some negative feelings towards the different, right? The world hates strangers. It is part of the human condition to have a lot of negative feelings about strangers. And when you wear a yarmulke, when you set yourself apart from the rest of society, all right, you will provoke some negative reactions. So it's not just a matter of your rights and you fulfilling your group destiny or group obligation, or you're standing up for your group, you're also challenging social norms. And in less tolerant, less pluralistic societies in the United States, there's going to be a lot of backlash. And that comes in part because these other societies, perhaps they have more cohesion and social trust and more of a one dominant culture. And that's going to come at a significant price for minorities, including my own group. And what's in the interest of my group is not necessarily in the interests of people outside of my group. So different groups have different interests.
That the blood made people thirst for more blood. And that 2 years later, that seems to be getting worse, not better.
And the other part of this, and this is particularly important in the European and in the UK context in particular, is this continued stubborn refusal to name who is committing these acts. So in 2017 in Manchester, which is where the attack of the other day happened, we had this terrible Islamist extremist suicide bombing at a concert, which killed more than 20 people. That was 2017. And the UK government started tracking terrorist attacks. And if you look at between 2017 and today, they classify 11 of the 19 terrorist attacks in the UK as being fueled by Islamic extremism. And this attacker named Jihad is a perfect example of the community that those attackers are coming from. He was a British citizen, came as a child from Syria. He clearly was radicalized and living in a world that encouraged this sort of behavior.
Right, terrible things will often happen to you in life if you are part of the wrong group in the wrong place at the wrong time. So when I read that former NFL quarterback and commentator Mark Sanchez got stabbed after an incident after midnight at a club, I remember saying nothing good happens after midnight. So simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, part of the wrong group, can get you killed. That's the reality of life. And encountering strangers can often be absolutely deadly. And so we are wired to have some suspicion and concern and some negative feelings about strangers. And then if you deliberately, as part of your life strategy, say, I am different from you, right, there comes a price with that. There are also many benefits, and I deliberately choose to pay that price. But there is a price, and people are not necessarily going to be particularly thrilled.
So the refusal of Keir Starmer, whose wife, by the way, is Jewish, to name that threat and to do it with clarity and to say, this is we are fighting an internal threat here of Islamic extremist terrorism in our own country that is actively attacking Jews. And it wasn't just the synagogue being attacked by this murderous man. It was the fact that over the last several years, it's always been framed, as you say, John, in the context of Israel's war against Gaza. I noticed reports today in the New York Times and elsewhere that framed it that way.
So I remember in the run-up to the 2016 election, it seems like there was some kind of horrific Islamic attack in the United States or elsewhere in the world on a regular basis. And then Islamic terror seemed to decrease during Donald Trump's first term. And then under Joe Biden, it ramped up again. So open question, right? Does a presidential administration have some effect on terror? And I think that people respond to incentives. So I think there's a there. And Islamic terrorists respond to incentives. And Islamic terror, along with other forms of violent crime, can be substantially crushed if we're willing to do very harsh things, not just to the offenders, but also to the offenders' group. Because even though classical liberalism is all about the individual and individual rights, and these are beautiful theories that can produce some beautiful results, they cannot hide the fact that the world works in a collective way. So if there's a group of Jews, say, engaged in bad behavior, and that their bad behavior hurts you, you're more likely to have negative feelings about me, even though I didn't engage in the bad behavior, but members of my group did. And we don't tend to relate to strangers as individuals. We tend to relate to strangers as members of an outgroup, and we all tend to essentialize outgroups, whether Christians, gays, whatever, blacks, whatever. We all tend to think, oh, they're one essential type that is different from me, and I have some concerns. So looking at the chat, Bob says that the Yom Kippur terror attack in Manchester, England. Judaism played a part. It's also a territorial conflict from the Middle East. Reality always wins. The downside of encountering the stranger can be catastrophic. So there can be many beautiful things to come out of a warm, open encounter with the stranger, but one has to take adequate precautions against the catastrophic possibility. So intimacy with the stranger, much more likely to be dangerous for you than intimacy with a member of your in-group.
And I paused for a minute while I was drinking my coffee, and I thought, no, actually, it was Hamas's attack on Israel. That is the proper framing of what's happened since October 7th. But these attacks on Jewish institutions, on schools, on shuls, on people who wear the kippah in places like the UK and throughout Europe have been going on for more than a decade. So this is something that I think the leaders of these countries, and Starmer is a terrible person to be leading a country in this moment because his entire Labour Party has been soaked in anti-Semitism for years. They should be saying what is fueling this and who the people committing these acts.
You know, it not just yesterday, but as Christine says, for the past 2 years, if you look at the images coming out of the UK and elsewhere, but really especially the UK, out of London, the quote protests, the riots, the pro-Hamas mobs, these images, and there's tons of them, and it happened in the wake of the attack yesterday, and it doesn't look remotely like Europe. I mean, it looks like you're looking at something.
So we all shape how other people relate to us, but we don't determine. So Jews can play a role in how other people relate to them. Blacks can play a role. Gays can play a role. And so recognizing that our choices and our behavior and our words has an effect on other people doesn't mean that we determine other people's actions. But we are so wired that we really only want to hear about how awesome our group is and how perfidious the out-group is. So if you want to rise in power and status within your group, the incentives broadly lie with telling your group that you're wonderful, that bad things that happen to your group have absolutely nothing to do with any choices made by members of your group, and that the groups with whom you have the most intense conflicts of interest, that they are perfidious. But how Israel conducts its war in the Middle East is going to shape and affect how non-Jews relate to Jews all around the world. And the more righteously Jews behave with regard to non-Jews, then in general, the better that non-Jews will relate to Jews. The better behaved gays, blacks, any minority group is, right, then the better behaved the majority will be with regard to them.
Out of the Middle East, you know, at any point in the past 3 decades, there's just the density of the mobs waving Palestinian flags, shooting off like I don't know, you know, flares,
incendiary devices.
So the Hebrew Bible often treats Jewish suffering as the product of Jewish behavior, and that if Jews would behave better, then they will have better quality of life. But this was not a popular message, I would imagine, 2,500 years ago. It's not a popular message now. And I'm not saying that Jews deserve the Yom Kippur attack or any such terror attack. I'm just making the commonsensical observation that we affect how other people relate to us. And I remember one time there was this woman screaming at a group of Jews that Jews were human traffickers. And I went up to this woman and said, "Oh, tell me more. I'm interested in what you have to say." So as soon as I showed her an interest in what she had to say, she stopped screaming. And we had a conversation. We had a 90-minute conversation. And she didn't like some Jewish choices, such as to buy human hair from women in India to make a sheitel, a Jewish wig. So many women in Orthodox Judaism, they shave their own hair and they wear a wig instead that is often made of hair from women coming from a third world country. And so she objected to that. She objected to some other Jewish practices. And it's like, okay, I understand where you're coming from. And she was Egyptian. I think she came from a secular Muslim upbringing. And she had many problems with Muslims. And we had a good conversation. And we had a good conversation because I told, look, I'm interested in what you have to say. And as soon as I said that, she stopped yelling. So you can take the temperature down with some people, not with all people, just by paying attention to what they have to say. And when someone makes a good point, even if they are your enemy, right, it just brings the tension down. You go, okay, I can understand that. I can relate to that.
Just ever been full of smoke, and it's like the recreation of a battle zone. It's pathetic and disgusting, and it when people talk about the death of Europe, you can see it in all this footage right before your eyes.
And Manchester has the largest Jewish population outside of London in the UK. It is the second largest Jewish population in the UK, and that is and there's also a very large Muslim population in Manchester. So that tension has been going on for a while. Sorry,
I want to read something real quick from the.
So if you're not Jewish, you're likely to relate to Jews as the essentialized other. That there's one Jewish condition. And yet, in reality, right, Jews in the United Kingdom are very different from Jews in Los Angeles, right? Jews in Los Angeles do not have the same fear of being attacked or persecuted for being Jewish that Jews in England do. Jews in England are very understated. They are much more aligned with working behind the scenes. They try to keep quiet. It's much more palpable fear. It feels like there's something like 50 times as many Muslims in the United Kingdom as Jews. And so Jews respond to incentives. Jews are profoundly affected by the culture around them. Who are the most polite Jews in the world? Right? Jews in England, because island nations such as England and Japan are very polite societies, and that wider society then has a profound effect on Jews. When the dominant culture around you, the dominant elite culture around you, say, prizes philosophy, then Jewish intellectuals will incline towards excellence in philosophy. When the dominant elite culture around you prizes law, then Jewish intellectuals will incline towards the study and development of law. When the dominant culture around you prizes literacy or technology, all right, that will affect the incentives for Jews living within that structure. So there was an excellent 5-part series in the New York Times this past week on abuses carried out by members of America's special forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this is something that the prestige media excels at, right? They have the resources and they go after bad behavior by their own team overseas. And yet war crimes committed by Americans against non-Americans doesn't really bother Americans. And war crimes committed by Australian soldiers overseas against non-Australians doesn't bother Australians, because we all primarily care about ourselves and our group, because it would not be evolutionarily adaptive to be any other way. Now, you can play the status game and say, oh, I'm really concerned by the behavior of my country's soldiers against, out groups on the other side of the world, and that's a particular status game. I do this show to angle for status, right? I want to do such a good show, such a great show, that I attract important, valuable, clear-thinking, intelligent, sensitive, morally developed viewers, and I hope to increase my real-life connection with such people and find a wife and get married and have kids, right? I am playing a status game right now. I want status for doing a little bit more of optimizing for truth than your typical show on these topics. So I am not above and beyond status games. You cannot avoid the competition for status. And if you're losing in a status game, then you're highly incentivized to demean the status game and point it out that it's a silly status game. And if you're winning at a status game, right, you're strongly incentivized not to admit that you're playing a status game. Instead, you're just that brave person seeking out truth. But the brutal fact is that people don't care about war crimes carried out by their team against outgroups, because caring about strangers conveys no reproductive advantage in most situations unless it can lead to higher status for you, right? That does lead to reproductive advantages, or if it can lead to trade or openness to new ideas, right? Then there are some reproductive advantages. But in general, being emotionally invested in strangers on the other side of the world carries no reproductive advantage and is very likely nonsense. And there's a terrific blog on this topic called Everything is Bull by UCLA psychologist David Pinsof. So you can care about these things, right, if you're playing a status game, because there are evolutionary reproductive advantages if you move up in status. But what is normal, natural human nature? To be tribal, to be factional, to be nepotistic, self-serving, moralistic, short-sighted, closed-minded, superstitious, self-deluded, selfish, right? We are not naturally motivated to make the world a better place. We are not naturally motivated to embrace the truth. We're not naturally motivated to see our own flaws, right? We love interesting information that is usually not true and not useful. And interesting podcasts and interesting social media posts, right, make it more difficult for us to see ourselves in the world accurately. But because it's interesting, we love it. We defend the status games that we are winning, right? Not the status games that improve the world, right? We defend the status games that we're winning that make the world a worse place, right? We're often enthralled to absolute nonsensical political beliefs, including the belief that we are morally and intellectually superior to outgroups, and every group thinks that they're superior to outgroups, right? And we should be troubled by this, but we're not. So David Pinsof, who writes this great blog, Everything is BS, says, where do I get my ideas? And he shares his patented formula. And this is such a concise, tight, effective way of looking at the world. So he writes, I look at a story that we tell ourselves. Maybe it's the pursuit of happiness or the meaning of life or our desire to change people's minds or to make the world a better place. Maybe it's the idea that we don't care what other people think. Then I ask myself if this story makes any evolutionary sense. If the answer is no, I think about what might be going on beneath the surface, something that would make evolutionary sense. So I then call the story that we tell ourselves bullshit. I write about what's likely going on beneath the surface, and I link to a lot of technical papers in evolutionary psychology that nobody clicks on. Now, the most important part of this formula is step 3. Right? Does this make evolutionary sense? And this step is rarely taken by anyone who thinks about human behavior. But if behavior or beliefs don't make any evolutionary sense, then you are dealing with BS.
Telegraph, they have a timeline of key events from yesterday up on their website, and here is the totality of the timeline. 11:15 a.m., he has a bomb, police told bystanders. 11:52 a.m., police being deployed to synagogues across the country. 12:17 p.m., 2 members of Jewish community killed. 3:30 p.m., Manchester synagogue killings declared terror attack. 7:13 p.m., scuffles break out at pro-Palestine march in Manchester. 7:31 p.m., I don't give a F about the Jewish community right now, says pro-Palestine professor. 10:19 p.m., this is the day we hoped we would never see, but we knew would come, says chief rabbi. So that's the entirety of the timeline of events yesterday. It is attacks happening to Jews, and in response, pro-Palestine, well, so-called pro-Palestine demonstrations in Manchester. What frame of mind you have to be in to demonstrate in Manchester while they're still combing the scene of a murder in synagogue on Yom Kippur in Manchester? I don't know, but it's not a good frame of mind. And
right, one of the downsides of a pluralistic society is that a lot of smart, educated, elite people thought it was a great idea to celebrate a terror attack, to celebrate mass murder and mass rapes, to celebrate things like October 7. All right, that's not a healthy society, right? That should be a major, major warning that we've gone really off base. And if we built a stronger dominant culture, that would be less likely to happen. So perhaps we should shape our immigration policy towards creating one stronger dominant culture that would disincentivize this kind of maladaptive behavior. Here's an interview with the AI Economist, the skill you need to stay employed in the age of AI. He says AI doesn't have judgment. Only humans can have judgment. AI just uses predictive models.
Everywhere where we've got people, is people applying judgment. In the examples you gave, it also means that AI could lead to less inequality in the workforce because it means somebody paired with an AI could do higher order work than they're currently doing today,
Well,
depending on
maybe.
the role.
It depends on judgment. In other words, what we don't know yet is, will judgment be more evenly distributed than prediction was, or will it be even more skewed? If it's more skewed, then there'll be even more inequality.
So I will side with the side of more inequality, and that judgment is correlated with IQ.
If it's more uniform, then there'll be less inequality, and we just don't know yet.
So what does that tell us about what we should be learning in school? So if we can easily see judgment and experience are key for the future of work, what should colleges be doing? How should they be reorganizing themselves? I mean, what conversations are you having here?
Trade-offs. So much has to do with it. Rather than learning facts, learning trade-offs, and therefore always asking why. So, in other words, let's say in history, rather than memorizing the facts, was at this point in history, given these things that just had happened, was a better decision to do this or do that? Why? And every time you ask the question why, then you're forced to think about the trade-offs. Everything you need an answer for, because that is how the role that we'll play in guiding the AI. And so it feels very much like we're heading into a world where the reason we have to be so good at why is because the AI does all the work sort of up to that point and then stops.
So we're all going to become executives, miniature chief executive officers of a bunch of AI systems. In the same way you would ask your team, why did you pick that? Why is this your presentation? We all have to do that for each and everything we do. So when you think about college then, how easy is it for a college to be redesigned this way? I mean, is college still worthwhile? But how and what college teaches needs to fund.
Right. I don't believe that you can teach independent thinking or judgment.
Reasons is, if the best way to learn judgment is by actually making real decisions that have consequences where you own the outcome, universities aren't the best designed for that. But we don't know. We don't know what the best way is of teaching judgment. I'm putting this out there as one of many ideas of how we teach judgment is through active decision making. But what I will say is that universities did adapt in the case of accounting. So in accounting, if you would have said 50 years ago to an accountant, your main part of your job is always going to be asking why, accountants would have said that's absurd. But now that's all they do, because the machine does all the arithmetic.
We've talked a lot about the cognitive workforce, but a few years ago you were on the Sanctuary podcast and you asked a question, and I actually want to rephrase it back to you.
So what makes Laura Loomer so powerful? And it's not just the inherent qualities of Laura Loomer, it's the particular situation that she finds herself in. And there were times when I was a relatively powerful blogger, and that's because I was tapped into people with important information. And Laura Loomer is tapped in, and she is funded by conservative donors who support right-wing positions on Israel and critical views of Islam. And one of her key connections is an Israeli-American cyber intelligence analyst, Yaakov Appelbaum. And he has provided her with a great deal of research for her posts. So you can become very powerful if you're simply tapped into people with valuable information. And Laura Loomer right now is tapped into people with valuable information, and that's what makes her so influential.
Maybe I do have an agenda. I mean, maybe there is a set of motivations which I'm not
a particular
motivated
agenda,
to acknowledge.
Yeah.
It's complicated. I mean, a lot of it is. I mean, that's such a complicated sort of can of worms to open.
Sure.
I mean, just to focus on one part of it, psychology and the social sciences overwhelmingly skewed towards the left, sort of liberal left politics. And, I think your prior should be that if you've got an entire field where people share political allegiances, that's going to influence the ways in which they seek out, interpret, evaluate, process information, and so on, conduct studies, operationalize things, how they measure things, etc. And then I think that should be your prior, based on general models of human psychology. And then I think when you look at misinformation research, just as you look at many aspects of the modern social sciences where they're studying sort of politically relevant things, I think you find lots of cases where these sorts of, progressive ideas, values, partisan allegiances influence the kind of research that they're doing. And, there's this sort of familiar set of coalitional dynamics where if you point that out, the inference people are going to draw on is you're not on the right team.
Right.
So there was an article in Time magazine published recently, which links one of my articles.
So you'll get a much easier life and likely to get a reproductive evolutionary advantage if you're a good member of your team, as opposed to optimizing for truth that goes against your group's interests.
As an example of someone defending the authoritarian agenda, i.e. defending Donald Trump and MAGA and so on, and his attacks on institutions, which, for anyone who knows anything about my political views, I find absolutely absurd. It's not at all a political coalition that I've got any sympathy for. But nevertheless, the idea is if you're criticizing, or at least if you're even just pointing out that there is a kind of liberal bias in this research in such a heated, polarized political context, then familiar coalitional dynamics are going to kick in, and it's going to be, well, like you're either with us or you're against us, right? If you're criticizing us in this way, you must be trying to support the other team.
Right.
And I think that makes sense in the context of ordinary kind of partisan debate. I think it's unfortunate that even there for various reasons, but I think it's so destructive to science because science, its esteem within society, which I think is, deserved for the most.
Right. Why have Republicans become anti-science? Because science has being taken over by the left and weaponized against them.
This part is wrapped up with the fact that it's our best way of escaping these kinds of partisan biases. We try to institutionalize various procedures and we try to enforce various sorts of norms, which are going to enable us to overcome these sorts of, familiar forms of coalitional politics to try to get at the.
So many of the more pious pronouncements by leading politicians in England after the Yom Kippur Manchester Synagogue terror attack praised first responders. Well, it turns out the police did not do such a great job, right? The police shot and killed the security guard by mistake. They shot and wounded a congregant. Now, I'm not sure I primarily blame the police, right? I put the blame on the terrorists who created a difficult, challenging situation for police. And I know that the more pressure I'm under, right, the less empathy I have for others, the more short I am with others, the worse my judgment, that my world just shrinks down, the more pressure I'm under. And once you launch a terror attack, you put a lot of pressure on people who then often make terrible decisions. I mean, can you believe this guy's name was Jihad, right? Our society should run on incentives. It should be clear that it's socially unacceptable to have the first name of Jihad. If we'd simply put more resources into catching violent criminals and keeping them imprisoned for longer or killing them if they have committed murder, we would have much less violent crime. This particular attacker, right, he'd already been arrested on suspicion of rape and he was out on bail.
The truth. And I think it's a real big problem for science, both in terms of its capacity.
That like misinformation research is skewing in a particular way. The one inference is like, well, you're for the other side. It's interesting that the inference isn't, well, what are the ways in which our values we're not living up to, right? Like, I mean, it would be nice if that was sort of the way people approach things. I mean, for reasons like David's studies, that's typically not. It's rare, but I mean, I think that would be the ideal, would be to sort of say, if we really think, if we really do hold these values, what would we predict in pointing out ways in which we're not being consistent, as David has documented well. It's sort of, it's being coalitional. I think that's a good adjective, right? Is to sort of, and this is for me, this is actually gets back to this question of like, what do I use my work for? And I often check myself just being, am I being coalitional about this, right? Like it feels good to sort of defend my side, but then I'm like, but is this a situation where I'm taking sides as opposed to taking a principle, right? And there's many times throughout, especially like if I look on social media or these things that are not just sort of dispassionate, like quote unquote boring scientific issues, but these charges.
That me personally, I, David Pinsof, have no hope of knowing what's true.
Right. So you get to truth when you think out loud with other people, because other people can often spot your biases much more clearly and accurately and quickly than you can.
Right.
Yeah.
I can wrap my head around the idea that as a society, if there are cultural evolutionary processes or incentives, that will societally push us toward true beliefs, or maybe it'll push the institution of science toward true beliefs. I can get behind that. But everything we know about our own psychology and our epistemology suggests that truth, if it exists, is an emergent phenomenon. It emerges from cooperative groups and institutions that are well designed.
So I probably spent 20 hours reading the work of this guy, David Pinsof, and listening to podcasts with him. And I haven't yet spotted any ideological or political bias, right? I want to accord him high status because he seems to me such a clear, honest truth seeker.
It is not a product of any individual human. No individual human is likely to have all the answers. Most individual humans.
Right. So group strategy, once again, beats out individual strategy, right? Individuals are not likely to arrive at truth on their own, right? We need other people to be part of the process, and truth emerges out of a social condition.
Humans have their own biases, their own agendas, their own limitations. So when I reflect on that, the ultimate conclusion is that I, David Pinsof, have no hope of achieving the thing that I want most, which is to know what's true. And that to me is really distressing. So what do you think about that? Has that occurred to you? How do you deal with that? Soothe me.
Yeah.
So you often get asked in, say, job interviews, how do you take constructive criticism? And nothing that is human is foreign to me. All right. There are times when I'm more touchy about constructive criticism than other times. My face might fall when I'm receiving just purely accurate constructive criticism. But accurate criticism makes us better, right? We are more likely to arrive at the truth when we're talking to other people.
I can't soothe you, unfortunately. It's a great question.
Watch some Jordan Peterson, David.
Yeah, maybe he's the
throwback.
He'll disabuse you of this humility.
Jordan Peterson knows what's true.
Yeah, I've written a few pieces sort of grappling with that, and I don't have a particularly satisfactory answer. Although interestingly, I'm not really bothered by it in the way that you seem to be bothered by it. So I think if I step back, I think I'm biased in ways that, some ways I'm probably vaguely aware of, and some ways I'm less aware of. And it's almost certainly true that I've got a very selective and partial picture of the world, and I'm fallible in all these different ways. So I do think a certain kind of skepticism is correct. I do think we tend to be absurdly overconfident about our capacity to know the world, especially when it comes to these sort of heated social and political phenomena. And I think that's just true. I think it's something you have to sort of face up to. In a way, the fact that you're facing up to it, I think, is it's a good signal of the fact that you're more reflective about these sorts of things than the average person. And one maybe small area where I disagree is you said that sort of knowledge is a consequence of not sort of individual level cognition, but these broader norms and institutions. And I think that's exactly right. But I'll just add that I do think there are individual differences in cognition. Often I think they're downstream of the social norms that get enforced in particular communities. Like if you're in a community where it's expected of you that you're going to provide evidence and arguments, at least of some kind, when you state a view, it's expected of you that you're going to acknowledge uncertainty if you want to win a good reputation and so on. You're going to end up with I think, more accurate understanding of topics than somebody who belongs.
So Jordan Peterson apparently is ill again. This is his daughter.
Hey guys, I have an update on my dad. I'm actually just going to read this. It's on my teleprompter, because this is too hard to explain off the cuff, so I wrote it out. This summer has been exceedingly difficult. Dad was in an ICU suffering from pneumonia and sepsis after dealing with a host of neurological issues this summer that we believe stem from SIRS, which is chronic inflammatory response syndrome due to decades of mold exposure. We don't have a better explanation for his neurological symptoms at the moment other than spiritual attacks. He's been suffering for the last number of years with unexplainable neuropathy and weakness, amongst other symptoms, but they worsened this summer after he cleaned out his parents' basement after his dad, my grandpa, passed away. We weren't able to communicate with Dad really all of September. During the end of the pneumonia, he was diagnosed with critical illness polyneuropathy, which we're hoping is critical.
So this is 16 hours ago. So this isn't the bad illness that he had a few years ago. So Chris Kavanaugh says maybe it's not toxic mold. Now it's demons
illness,
or some other
myopathy,
malevolent spiritual
which is
force.
bad enough.
It'd obviously be much better for Jordan Peterson, right, if he retired from punditry to read the Bible and focus on his family and his health. I don't think Dennis Prager, for example, did himself any favors by releasing a video about a week ago. But there's something often unusual in people like myself and people like Jordan Peterson and people like Dennis Prager are just so desperate to share our opinions with the world, right? It's not normal, and it's probably not healthy.
It's been heartbreaking and brutal on top of everything else. But after almost a month in the ICU, he's been moved out to a less urgent floor. Praise God for that. We're still in the midst of this, but now we're seeing improvements daily. The timeline for his full recovery is hard to tell at the moment, and I'll update everyone when we have more information. My family's asking for prayers. Like I said, this summer's been exceedingly difficult and terrifying. Dad's condition is complicated by the fact he can't take most medications without suffering from severe paradoxical reactions, which limits treatment options. Like I mentioned, I believe there's a spiritual element at play here. I think a lot of people have felt it in the last few weeks and months. It's been hitting my dad and my family hard this summer. In August, the day Dad was brought to a hospital by ambulance, my newborn Audrey was also brought to a hospital by ambulance within hours of each other. It was unbelievable. This was the second time this summer we had brought Audrey to the hospital after she almost died from near heart failure at 6 weeks old. That is exceedingly rare, and they couldn't find a cause for. She was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary hypertension, which seems to have resolved. Praise God.
So a lot of conversation about demons and cosmic spiritual struggles in right-wing political discourse because it just makes life much more exciting. It's not sickness, right? You're not experiencing difficulties or sickness or any life-threatening challenges because of anything natural. It's because you are fighting in a cosmic spiritual struggle. Donald Trump's Middle East peace plan, right? It's just funny that this came about as a result of, one, Israel's terrible decision on September 9 to bomb Qatar, and then Donald Trump's desperate desire for a Nobel Peace Prize, right? Trump's playing the status game, and big doors swing on these small hinges. And so when Israel attacked Qatar and the aftermath was absolutely disastrous for Israel, and now we may well be closer than we've ever been to some peace in the Middle East, largely driven by Donald Trump's desire for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh, it's been a feature for a while. And of course, if you go back to the founding of Republic, there were lots of politics of personal destruction and lawfare. I mean, it's not like a 20th or 21st century phenomenon, but it's certainly because of social media and digital. It's certainly since post Watergate, it's a horse of a different color, and it's extremely dangerous. And I think the main reason to be pessimistic is we had 3 straight 2-term presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, all of whom put ending this kind of stuff central to their candidacies and their presidencies. All of them 1-2 terms, first time we've had 3 straight 2-term presidents since the founding of the Republic. And yet each of them left office with the country more polarized and more lawfare than when they took over after 8 years. So I don't know what the dynamics are or dynamics would be exactly, or who the leader exactly would be. But I know the only way to think about trying to fix it is to do some pretty rigorous analysis of the incentive structure that exists now. Why is it in politicians' interest to do this? Because the vast majority of Americans, I believe, and I think the data is quite clear in this, they're not interested in that. They're not interested in lawfare. Polls show it's not very popular. So why do politicians do it even though it's unpopular? Because the bases love it. The bases demand it. So I think you got to figure out how you elevate the power of the center and of those not even on the center who don't want this. You got to figure out how to elevate their power. And I think if you do that, you could be optimistic that it could end.
Well, one of the things, Mark, it seems to me, is the implication of what you're saying is, as long as we're this polarized, lawfare.
It would be funny if Donald Trump gets a Nobel Peace Prize because the people behind it are afraid not to give him a peace prize, right? They may very well absolutely loathe him, but they may very well fear the consequences of not giving him a peace prize.
Out, the politicians have less of an incentive to do it. If you look at the press coverage of the 4 Trump indictments, and I disagree with Joe about probably every one in the way you characterize them, but the press rooted for those indictments, rooted for them, hoped they would stop Trump from winning. And that turned a lot of people against the Democrats, even if they didn't like Trump, because they thought that was unfair.
Can I sneak in here with one other thought? I came to the Free Press. I was a New York Times person, columnist, writer for 12, 13 years.
And consistently displayed contempt for conservatives and conservative positions.
You left out the word fabled. You were fabled. Fabled New York Times columnist.
There you go.
Sorry.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
If only Andrew Rosenthal agreed with you. But I was a committed reader.
So Andrew Rosenthal is the head of the op-ed page who got rid of people like Joe Nocera.
And it was not until I came to the Free Press that the thought ever even occurred to me that something might be wrong with any of these prosecutions.
Referring to the prosecutions of Trump. So we often have to change our situation before we see things. So it's only when his situation changed that he became open to a different perspective.
And again, it was my colleague Eli Lake writing about Alvin Bragg that turned the light bulb on in my head. And it's like, oh, there is another way of looking at this. There are people who have different ideas about this. And, I now see this in a very, very different way, especially that one, although I'm still more liberal than not. And my point is just, if you're on the left and your diet is the Times and the other liberal media who were, I agree with you entirely, Mark, we're rooting for this, not just on the op-ed pages, but also in the news pages. You just have no perception that there is another point of view here.
Yeah, pains me, but it's true.
Because we're talking about the divisions in America right now, and this control that both parties' bases have over the party at this point, and the online radicalization that's gone on. And this was all really, these divisions were all laid bare by the assassination.
Think about how disconnected from reality you must be, how you must live in a bubble to think that publicly celebrating an assassination of a fellow American is a good idea.
Of Charlie Kirk earlier this month, a horrible moment. And I remember I was working that night. I didn't check my social media the next day, but there were people who I knew, acquaintances of mine, friends of mine, people I've spent a lot of time with, and they were not justifying the assassination, but they were walking right up to that line, talking about it's like, well, he did say this about guns. And then there's the famous misquote of him going around about black women. He said this, he said that, the implication being he had it coming. Some people were more forthright. They said, it's like, you know what, Charlie Kirk, I have no pity, I have no sympathy here.
If you're simply a fan of honest debate, all right, you will have many reservations about Charlie Kirk's debate tactics. All right, it should not be socially unacceptable to point out your disagreements with Charlie Kirk or your reservations about his rhetorical style. Right, if you go and then outright celebrate, all right, there are going to be repercussions, and it also matters, right, how prestigious your position. Right, the more prestigious your position, the more vulnerable you are to cancellation. The New York Times did an article on what Donald Trump's sports fandom says about him, and it concluded that Donald Trump cares about greatness, disrespect, that he is keenly attuned to status and recognition. Well, one of the good things about Donald Trump is how raw he is. Right? We all want to associate ourselves with high status people. Right? We're all keenly attuned to status and to recognition. It's just that Donald Trump is much less filtered with regard to these things. So Donald Trump lavishes his favorite athletes with praise. Right? He complains when he feels they're snubbed. Right? He is obsessed with toughness, and he brings it back to winning and losing. So Trump sees the world pretty much through the lens of winning and losing. So Trump sees sports as he sees politics, a contest where the winners are strong and the losers are weak, and toughness, loyalty, and patriotism are interchangeable virtues. So we tend to see the world not as it is, but as we are. And I notice in particular with regard to AI, pretty much everyone sees in AI their pre-existing worldview. So if you're naturally happy and optimistic, you have a happy, optimistic view of AI. If you naturally incline towards a doomer perspective, then you jump on the board, oh, we're doomed.
And there was an attempt, and I'm not sure how strong it is still at the moment, particularly after Jimmy Kimmel's reinstatement, but there was an effort you saw on social media to find not only public figures, but random people, police in South Carolina, things like that, who are posting on their Facebook page things that are not nice about Charlie Kirk and trying to get them fired. It was the right fully embracing cancel culture in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before. And Mark, you've talked about this, and I want to just to get your kind of broad thoughts on this right-wing embrace of cancel culture and whether it can even work. Because on the left with cancel culture, you know, I see liberals kind of have the commanding heights of our cultural institutions. And so, you know, they can just, some actor on some TV show says, I'm not going to get the vaccine, and they get fired. This effort, this kind of ground up effort from Twitter and social media to get rid of public officials and also just kind of like normal people who have posted insensitive things about Charlie Kirk, I'm not sure it's going to be effective. It's certainly, to someone like me.
Okay, that's a dishonest framing. People aren't getting fired and getting major blowback for posting insensitive things. People are running into pain and adverse consequences when they publicly celebrate an assassination.
A giant turnoff because I just don't like cancel culture, period. But Mark, I just want to get your thoughts on this, on righty cancel culture, how it differs from liberal cancel culture, and whether it could actually work in the way that it's intended, whether it can actually silence people and intimidate people as the cancel culture regime of 2020 did. You're talking about Jimmy Kimmel specifically.
Yeah, specifically Kimmel, but I'm also...
You're talking about Jimmy Kimmel specifically.
Yeah, specifically Kimmel, but I'm also talking about the Biden administration in trying to intimidate and successfully intimidating the social media platforms.
Yes.
From writing things about the Hunter Biden laptop, from writing about COVID. And again, this is another case where the press's unfair treatment is keeping us from having a legitimate debate. Take the sum total of what's been written in the New York Times and the Washington Post about the FCC chair and Jimmy Kimmel, and with a negative slant, quoting people, this is an abuse of power. That took place over a week. Think about how many articles you've read in the New York Times and the Washington Post about the Biden administration's abuse of power, intimidating the social media platforms. How much? Far less, barely any. Even though you could argue that was far more egregious, in part because the FCC does have oversight because of licenses of these stations, whereas the Biden administration really has no statutory oversight over these social media platforms. So part of the issue is, once again, as was the case with our previous topic, The press has to cover it fairly. They need to be equally outraged about attempts to cancel people, right? Same thing, as they are on both sides. Same thing. You've read in the last week all these stories in the press, and Washington Post, New York Times especially, about how horrible it is that Republicans are organizing to get people fired. Did not read a lot of stories about how horrible it was the liberals were organizing to get people fired. That double standard really rubs people the wrong way. And again, it keeps us from having a serious conversation. I think that, what conservatives are saying, it's different. We're not canceling people for things they said a long time ago. We're canceling them for things they said now. I don't buy that as a distinction. I think in general, people...
It's better to have power than to not have power, and we all try to create a niche that is better suited for ourselves and for our group. And the reasons that we give for why we make the choices that we do, right, are not always accurate. People don't usually say what they mean or mean what they say. And so people who are not on the left are usually glad right now that Donald Trump is president and is exercising presidential power on our behalf. David Pinsof, UCLA evolutionary psychologist, I love his blog, Everything is Bullshit, and he notes this profound insight. People are only as good as their incentives. So I've had employers or clients for whom I went all out. I would run through a brick wall for these people. And then other people who demeaned me, I wouldn't make that effort, right? We're as good as our incentives, and our behavior will largely be aligned with incentives. Now, this is, I think, an important truth, but it's not a sexy story, because what is interesting and compelling is usually not true and not important. But our behavior is largely determined by our incentives. So incentive determinism is obvious, it is true, it is profound, but it's not interesting and exciting. Right? It's a cold, alien way of thinking. We prefer to think in terms of stories. Right? We want to see the world as revolving around a colorful cast of characters representing warring tribes whom we either love or hate. And we tend to infer people's character by the words that they use and the order in which they use these words. So people love this verbal shortcut to identify the bad guys. So we're strongly incentivized to talk the right way for our group, right? And we naturally incline towards thinking that bad things are caused by bad people, good things are caused by good people, bad people are bad because they're just inherently bad, and it's demonstrated by them talking the wrong way. Good people are just inherently good, and you can spot it when they talk the right way. Therefore, if everybody simply talks the right way and nobody talks the wrong way, then everything will be good. Now, this is nonsense, but this is modern discourse, right? We try to get people to talk the right way. We try to prevent them from talking the wrong way, and we don't really talk about which incentive structures are best. But we spend tons and tons of time talking about which sets of words are the right words and which sets of people are the right people, right? And this is why we say words on podcasts and publish words, because we want to show that we are the right people with the right words. And if everyone just says certain words loudly enough, we'll have a much better world. But a much truer and more profound analysis of the human condition is people respond to incentives.
Pretty clear on this. If Comey hadn't done what he did with Hillary Clinton, Trump would never have been president. And so one of my favorite moment in and I write about this in the thing I wrote in the Daily Mail was the day Comey was fired by Donald Trump. And right after Comey was fired, Stephen Colbert, I had a little brain freeze because I was thinking of Jimmy Kimmel. Stephen Colbert was taping his show. And of course, his audience is a bunch of liberals. And he comes out in his monologue and he says, just a few minutes ago, Donald Trump fired James Comey. And the audience is confused about what to do. Because on the one hand, most of them, when they thought James Comey, they thought, well, this is the guy who helped Trump get elected. So great that he was fired. On the other hand, if Trump fired him, he must be a good guy. And the audience is kind of paralyzed, cheering, stunned silence. They don't know what to do. And Colbert's confused too. Like he thinks it's bad that they're firing Comey, but on the other hand, Comey's the villain. So my point is that even back then, even before the indictment, just in the beginning of the Trump administration, like in May of his first term, even back then, Comey confused everybody because the press, knocked him down after he helped Trump win the election. And then, the press rallied to him after Trump fired him as FBI director. He's a confusing guy and a confused guy, but the through line of the whole thing is he's a bad guy. And he's lauded, and partly by himself and his PR efforts, he's lauded as some hero.
He's also an incredibly weird guy. I mean, Mark, I'm sure you saw his clip about Taylor Swift on his Substack recently.
Oh,
talking about how he's deadpanning right to camera in front of a wall with the lens like an inch away from his face, seemingly, about how he's a Swiftie. His social media posts about, there was like the 86 one. He just posts random pictures of trees. He seemed to be flirting with the idea that he could run for president at one point. He's extremely strange, and I wonder how he lasted so long in Washington, even before the Trump-Clinton race.
These are framed. This is framed perfectly. It takes a lot to creep me out. His Instagram videos, they creep me out. I want to turn.
So Halperin was all set to write a killer best-selling book about the 2016 presidential election, but then he got canceled in the Me Too movement. But if he'd ever published that book, he would have given us a lot of devastating stories about James Comey.
Away. It's like watching like the horror movie Freaks. It's just, there's something about like the color of his skin. It's uneven. I don't know. There's just, he's a freaky guy. And
he's posting so much cringy, freaky stuff because apparently there's no one who loves him, who's close to him, who can warn him about what he's doing.
He needs like a best friend to tell him to do another take. Like no,
Robert
don't post
Mueller.
that version. Yeah, don't pass that version. Back away from the camera, do another take. Let's look at it together. But he posts take one, I guess.
Yeah. That's, what'll be really sad is we find out he's posting take like 34. That it's not impossible.
That's it. But he's sitting there with his friend who's like a Hollywood director. It's like, yeah, that's the best take. Post that one. That's the winner. No, they're creepy. First of all, we're dealing with a woman. I'm exercising my inner Maureen Callahan here. We're dealing with a woman who was married to.
All right, this is Halperin talking about the breakup between Nicole Kidman, the actress, and Keith Urban, the singer.
Tom Cruise. Okay, so let's just stipulate that, like, maybe her personal choices aren't the very best.
She's probably a little weird.
Yeah, and then I don't know. I'm going to go back and pull the clips, but every time I saw them at an award show, it just seemed spooky.
Right, we get creeped out by people because we learn and navigate the world in large part through our feelings, and feelings are often a much more reliable and quicker guide to reality than our rational reasoning.
The energy between them seems spooky. So count me down as not the least bit surprised that this marriage did not go on forever and ever. And I'll be curious to see who she dates next, because maybe the third time's the charm.
Right. I love Halperin's understated humor. All right. In this clip, Halperin talks about how Donald Trump is determined not to play the sucker. And when you see that clip of Ali G interviewing Donald Trump, it's Trump was about the fastest interview subject to recognize that he didn't want to be the sucker. So there's a good bit from this same interview here.
In conjunction with his time in power. This one has kind of greased the skids a little bit. So I think this one's we could probably live with this one.
Well, to me, it's just the double-edged sword of Trumpism, which is that a lot of these, if we found out that Jared Kushner, with relation hypothetically to the Obama administration, had been working on this deal, he would never have been in the front row at this press conference because it would have been so shameful. So, and for some good reasons, of course, because there's an obvious conflict of interest. On the other hand, Trump sort of openly embraces the conflict of interest, whether it's Witkoff's Middle East real estate deals throughout time or Jared Kushner's, as the way that you do the deal. And that is still, it's still sort of unusual.
Yeah, this illustrates one of I've not had many insights in my life, about Donald Trump or anything else, but this illustrates one of the few insights I've had, which is, and this comes from talking to Donald Trump about the American presidency going back to when I first started talking to him in 2011. Donald Trump's view is he's not going to be the sucker who underuses the office of the presidency. So he says, okay, what did LBJ do when he was president? He got rich in the office by trading on his power to make money. So Trump's attitude is, I'm not going to be the sucker who doesn't do at least what LBJ did and maybe a little bit more to get rich while he's in office. So you see that also with the indictment of Comey. Trump would say, well, Nixon used the Justice Department to go after his enemies. I'm not going to be the sucker who leaves power on the table, who doesn't use the office to my maximum advantage. As long as a predecessor president did something, I'm going to do it too. And I think that's his attitude towards making money as president. He looks at Nancy Pelosi and LBJ and other people who got rich while in office, and he's like, I'm not going to be a sucker. I'm not going to leave the money on the table.
Russ Douthat is an opinion columnist at the New York Times. He is a skeptic, not a supporter of Donald Trump, but he is on the right. And he's got a column out about the breakdown of liberalism and how the post-liberal tendencies on the left and the right demonstrate themselves differently. So on both sides, there is an impulse to police and to censor speech. And there is an increasing desire to increase in-group identity. And there is increasing impatience with claims to neutrality and procedural fairness. And there is a dominant desire on both sides of the political spectrum to reduce all politics to a life and death conflict. But the way that these tendencies take hold demonstrate themselves differently on the left versus the right. So you have to begin with this crucial asymmetry. In the United States and in Europe, right, it is people who are left of center who run and control almost all of our institutions. So in both Europe and the United States, the political right has plenty of popular support, but it has very little influence inside the managerial systems through which power and institutions operate. So progressivism, the left, starts with a weaker base of popular support, right? Far more Americans identify as conservative than liberal, but liberals dominate our key institutions. People on the left dominate the key institutions in the United States and Europe. So people on the left have this extraordinary advantage in our institutions, private institutions, public institutions, right? They are the people who run and shape the power structure. So when liberal norms are losing popular acclaim, right, each side is embracing post-liberalism in a way that plays to its strengths. So because of a lack of human capital and a lack of people who are right-wing in our major institutions, the only way for the right to take over institutions is from the top down, where Donald Trump issues edicts or Elon Musk buys Twitter. The left pursues its agenda through increasingly radical measures carried out through complex, indirect, and bureaucratic means, right? They use state power and institutional power, usually subtly, to reshape institutions, public and private, and to create systems that repress people from saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing without being obviously police state repressive. On the other hand, the populist right consistently revolves around some charismatic outsider politician who attacks the institutions, who attacks the existing political class that's hopelessly compromised, claims to have a mandate to sweep away their rule. So whether it's Donald Trump or Nigel Farage in Britain or Marine Le Pen in France or Viktor Orban in Hungary or Giorgia Meloni in Italy, right, in the post-liberal populist world, it's intensely loyal to charismatic leaders, and these people become the focus of loyalty and intense opposition. They present themselves as champions of the forgotten man, and they are attacked as dictators in the making. While people on the left, right, they try to effect dramatic changes outside of politics, outside of the democratic process. They try to survive or sidestep backlash from voters, and they try to get things done subtly behind the scenes through control of institutions.
So in the paper, I sort of take great pains to distinguish between politics and morality, because I think they're too often conflated in a way that causes a lot of confusion. And the reason they're conflated is because politics almost always masquerades as morality in order to achieve its political objectives. That is, in order to rally people to our side, we have to convince people that our side is the good side, the moral side, the virtuous side, and the other side is evil, unfair, disrespectful, etc. So morality is our chief weapon in our political arsenal, and that is why it is often so easy to confuse morality with politics as if they were the same thing. That is, to confuse moralism with morality. And in the paper, I try to differentiate politics and morality in the following way. I describe politics as being centrally about conflict and loyalty to one or the other side of that conflict. That's what I think politics is ultimately about. Okay. And morality is ultimately about cooperation, that is, working together for a mutual benefit, and impartiality to either side of a conflict and working to resolve conflicts. So
this is the most profound theory of how politics works in reality that I have heard yet.
In that sense, once you cleave politics from morality, morality starts to look pretty nice. So in that sense, I don't think that morality, as distinguished from politics, can be described in the same sort of cynical terms as being about, self-interested flouting of moral principles. I think we do have genuine moral principles that are shared between liberals and conservatives. I think the prevailing view that ideologies are about moral disagreement is actually backwards. I think at the heart of our political disputes is moral agreement. That is, we are using the same moral language, the same moral intuitions to try to win political conflicts. We're trying to cast our side as the fair side, as the side for freedom, the side for patriotism, the side for compassion. And we couldn't have those political fights if both sides didn't care about compassion, freedom, fairness, etc. So I think...
Right, so the interview subject in this video, David Pinsof, is a professor of evolutionary psychology at UCLA, and here he's talking about the alliance theory of political belief systems.
We have common moral intuitions that partisans compete to activate, and that underlies a lot of our political discourse.
And so, again, if your theories...
There are some personality differences between liberals and conservatives. There are some psychological differences between liberal and conservatives. The question is, what role do they play? In my view, they play a secondary role to alliances. And there are two ways that personality... the first way is that your psychological traits might predispose you to join certain alliances over others. That is, you might be inclined to side with people who are like you or who act in the interests of people who are like you.
So I don't know if David Pinsof is Jewish, but Pinsof is a Jewish name. I think it's highly likely he is.
So that's one possible mechanism. So for example, if I am sexually restricted and uptight about sexual promiscuity, I might be more inclined to become religious. And if I'm more sexually promiscuous, I might be less inclined to become religious. I might abandon my religious upbringing. Mm-hmm. And of course, so there'd be a causal pathway between your sexual strategy.
Right. Often people have a sexual strategy first, and then if their sexual strategy is monogamy, right, they are much more likely to be religious. And if their sexual strategy is promiscuity, they are much less likely to be religious.
Your religiosity and your ideology. But ultimately, the religiosity is what's predicting the ideology, not the sexual strategy directly. It's predicting loyalty to fellow sexually restricted people and wanting to advance their group interests. So that's one way. The other way is that the group you belong to or ally with shapes your personality or your psychological traits. There are plenty of ways you could see that if you belong to a religion.
Right, so the more time I spend around academics, the more incentivized I am to frame things and discuss things in academic terms. The more time, for example, I might spend on the app Perligo, the Netflix of academic textbooks, instead of listening to podcasts. So I subscribed to Perligo about a month ago, spent $144 for a year-long subscription. I really want to get my money's worth. So a lot of the time that I used to spend listening to podcasts and watching Netflix are now listen to all sorts of academic textbooks when I'm walking or cleaning or exercising. And on the other hand, if I spend time around influencers or podcasters or journalists, right, the more I tend to see the world in those terms. I go where the love is, right? Whichever group tends to be giving me the most love, right? That has a profound effect on how I think.
Religious community, they're going to pressure you to behave in ways that that mark you as a member of that religious community and distinguish you from other communities. They're going to want you to profess your devotion to the religion's creeds, to purge all doubts and uncertainties from your mind, to become more sexually restricted. So it might work the other way as well. So there are really two possible ways. So your personality might cause you to join certain alliances over others, or your alliance might shape your personality. And I think both of those mechanisms are compatible with alliance theory and compatible with the idea that alliances are ultimately the direct primary cause of our political beliefs.
And so your paper is all about a sort of new approach in political psychology, what you call there a shift from deep-seated moral values to ever-shifting alliances and rivalry. So before we move on from this topic to another one, I would like to ask you, so do you think that if you're correct and if basically we told people about this, that when people get frustrated because, for example, from someone from their own political group, political party, for example, they find out that they have also alliances to some extent with people from other political ideologies, and they get very frustrated and they call them, for example, hypocrites or traitors or turncloaks or something like that. Do you think that it could help people perhaps be a little bit more understanding of where?
So if you don't read opposing points of view, right, you're going to be less likely to accord contrary perspectives any respect, and you're going to be less likely to see the humanity in your opponents. If you do listen to, for example, the best of the left, you have to be impressed at times with all sorts of insights that you didn't have when you're just solely consuming podcasts and writings from your point of view. So David Pinsof writes this blog, Everything is Bullshit, and his bottom line, right? People are motivated purely by self-interest, family interest, and group interest, right? No other motives exist because no other motives can survive the Darwinian process. And when we pretend to have motives different from these, it's because we're playing a status game, right? If you have genes that incentivize nepotism, meaning favoring your own family, right, that will encourage you to lavish resources on people who share your genes, and that will be a type of Darwinian accounting, right? There is an evolutionary reproductive advantage to be nepotistic. Then if you have a gene for loyalty to your group, right, you'll be incentivized to help your group, your allies, and they in turn will be incentivized to help you. And being loyal to one side will inherently mean spurning the other. And as resources are limited, right, as we in our group get more and more stuff, we're simultaneously taking it away from other people. And reproductive fitness is always relative. It's always about who is out reproducing whom. So when our reproductive fitness goes up, someone else's goes down, which means when our status goes up and our fitness goes up, right, we are hurting our rivals and we're helping our allies, right? This is the tribal view. So this is what drives us: self-interest, family interest, group interest. We love to be interesting because when we're interesting, we capture people's attention, and that makes us feel smart and that makes us feel important. I remember people would often remark, I don't have a clue what you're saying when you're asking questions in class, but you're obviously just thrusting for attention. And psychologists in particular, they love to compete with the most surprising, interesting, gee whiz findings. These are also the findings that are most likely to be false. But academics, like non-academics, love to appear interesting to their peers. So the stranger the finding, right, the more exciting, the more unusual, the more interesting the finding, right, the less likely it is to be true, less likely it is to be useful. And so the stranger the finding, right, the less likely it is that the common people will buy into it, which separates you from the plebs. And there are the positive psychologists who study how to be happy, even though very few people really want to be happy, right? And positive psychologists want to signal, hey, look at me, I am such a nice person. Then there are the political psychologists who are almost always on the left, and they study all the ways in which people on the left are morally and intellectually superior to conservatives, even though people on the left and the right have the same human nature. And we all have a tendency to view out-group competitors as morally and intellectually inferior to us. So people on the left do this, people on the right do this. We all naturally tend to essentialize out-groups. Now, psychologists have motives that are just as flawed and greedy and self-interested as the rest of us, right? They are no more noble seekers of wisdom and virtue than plumbers, right? They're just flawed human beings like the rest of us. And people who study people, right, are human and selfish and self-interested. So we need more rigorous theories coming from psychology, ones that leverage insights from evolutionary biology and that give psychologists less wiggle room to BS in their theorizing. We need to have stronger incentives for uncovering true information rather than just that which is interesting. Right? We need prediction markets. We need adversarial collaborations. We need pre-registration of hypotheses. We need greater funding and support for replication. And perhaps we even need to psychologize the psychologists so we know what they're up to. And the author David Pinsof says, look, my motives are just as unflattering. I'm human. Right? I'm as vainglorious as the next guy.
That behavior comes from, and perhaps also the fact that they probably also do that themselves, and I mean perhaps be a little less divisive in their political approaches, or is that too optimistic?
I'm torn on that. I definitely think knowledge is a good thing, and knowledge of the truth might help us solve our problems, and in particular our political problems. Sometimes studying this makes me depressed and cynical and pessimistic. Sometimes I see a bit of a silver lining. I think one silver lining you might see is that this shows us that we're really not as different as we think we are. That we don't have these deep-seated worldviews that are completely clashing and at odds with one another. We don't have fundamentally different moral principles. We basically have the same moral principles. We all care about fairness. We all care about helping people who are truly in need. We all care about welcoming people into our group when they pose no threat and when they're willing to be an asset to our group. And the differences really come from our beliefs about those things, about what is unfair, what is fair, whether the people we want to welcome really are a threat or not, whether the people we want to help really are in need. Those are really what political differences are about. They're not about an absence or a presence of compassion.
So our political beliefs are largely aligned to compete for power, status, and resources with our rivals, right? Why do we hold the political beliefs we do? Not because they're true, right? Our beliefs are mainly about rallying support for the various factions and interest groups in our coalition. Truth is beside the point. Whatever makes the country better is beside the point, right? Our politics is essentially no different than the politics of chimpanzees. We form complicated alliances to compete for power, status, and resources. Main differences between us and other animals are that our alliances are bigger and more complicated. We have stranger bedfellows, such as the alliance between devout Christians and wealthy libertarian business people in the Republican Party. And so if you are a member of the elite, if you are highly educated, right, you are supposed to care a lot about politics, right? The more prestigious your position in society, the more you are supposed to care about politics and to nod your head in agreement whenever people engage in partisan rants, and you're pretty much obligated to join in on the ranting. It's a social ritual that is old as our species. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And ranting against shared enemy is the easiest way of making friends. It's easier than talking about ourselves, our passions, our tastes, our experiences, our curiosities. It's easier than trying to find truth or understand how the world works or why people like us are so peculiar. It's easier than talking about our families. So being terribly political, right, is an advantage, the more prestigious your position in society. And there's a new book out called Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics. Right? Politics is not the only way or even the best way to make the world a better place. There are a lot of things that are much more important than politics. We have thousands of books published every year with the implicit message that we should care more about politics, but there's only one book, to my knowledge, that argues the opposite, and this one's called Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics.
Or an absence or a presence of a willingness to welcome people to the group, or an absence or a presence of concerns for fairness. So I think at the heart of our political disputes is a shared moral psychology. And I think that should challenge the idea that one side is inherently morally superior to the other side, at least in terms of their underlying character. Maybe their beliefs make them do things in the world that are bad. But in terms of their underlying character, their moral psychology, their intuitions, the way they interact with their family and their friends, most people are pretty decent people. And yeah, sometimes they can have beliefs that make them do terrible things, but I think it's worth remembering that we're not as different as we think we are.
Yeah, I was also perhaps thinking about the fact that if people understand that people's political beliefs and their own political beliefs are not so as coherent or consistent as they think, that perhaps when they, for example,
So one of the interesting posts that I saw from David Pinsof is this very sharp observation. The interesting is rarely true and rarely important. So here are the things that we tend to find interesting. And it is largely stuff that is false and useless. And we know it. And we will often freely admit it. We'll call this stuff fiction. And we tend to be much more interested in fiction than in reality. Right? Novels sell better than textbooks. Movies sell better than documentaries. Tabloids are 1,000 times more interesting than scholarly journals. We're often interested in celebrities, even though we'll never meet them. Useless. We're interested in sports, even though we have no effect on the outcome. Probably useless. We're interested in sweeping generalizations, even though reality is complicated. We're interested in eloquence. We're interested in enthralling speakers and stylish prose. But eloquence has nothing to do with truth or use. Same for charisma, humor, whimsy, wit, passion, irony, quirkiness. We're interested in the new, even though the vast majority of useful truths are old. We're interested in spiritual flim-flam about the meaning of life, even though it's too vague to be useful. We're interested in self-help gurus who can confidently tell us that we can be the best, even though that is logically impossible. We're interested in contrarian hot takes, even though the conventional wisdom is usually more true and more useful. We're interested in simplistic partisan rants. We tend to be bored by nuanced policy analysis. We're interested in stuff that confirms our preconceptions. What is actually useful? The tax code, home repair, how cars work, retirement planning, non-collateralized loans, the policies that go through Congress, the words that we sign through DocuSign in contracts. So human beings have been around for about 200,000 years. And most of the time, we really aren't that incentivized to be interested in what is true and what is useful. So we use much of our brain power to rationalize and excuse our own bad behavior, to gossip about office politics and our social life, right? So our brain isn't a fundamentally social brain, and it's not primarily a truth-seeking brain. So this is what we find interesting. We want to fit in with our group. We want attention. We want to form cliques. We want to display our superiority. We want to display our group's superiority. We want to persuade people. We want to signal. We want to be flattered. We want to one-up everyone else. We want to show that we're on the same page as the people we want to be close to. And we want to be associated with high-status people. So when you encounter someone who's eloquent and cool and they're witty and creative, right, very likely to be high status. And if you can connect with someone who's high status, right, that can increase your own status.
Your side.
Yeah.
Once you realize that your side is just a cobbled together patchwork of inconsistent beliefs.
Right.
That if you think that your side has a coherent...
Right. Maha makes no sense to me. Steve Saylor wrote a column about Bobby Kennedy and the MAGA movement makes no sense. But if it helps Donald Trump get elected, then I'm not going to devote a lot of time trying to take down MAGA.
Principled moral philosophy, and you see someone deviating from that, well, then you might think that they're evil or insane or stupid, right? But if you see your side as not having a coherent or principled philosophy, then you might be a little bit softer on people who might deviate from it, because if they're deviating from it, maybe they're deviating from it in a good way. Yeah, that's one hopeful way of looking at it. I'm not optimistic about political extremists being softened by these ideas, but I think it might affect people who are a bit more moderate at the margins.
Mm-hmm. And so,
and he's got another theory that I love, and I think is profound: intergenerational competition theory. So, countries that get a little bit wealthier each generation tend to be stable, peaceful, and relatively happy. It's only when people despair about being more economically well off than their parents that things start to fall apart. So the burn it all down of Trumpism and the huge increase in the deaths of despair, it's not because Americans are necessarily so poor and disadvantaged, it's that people see themselves as significantly poorer and more disadvantaged than their parents, right? People assume that they're going to be better off than their parents. So it just feels wrong to us to not be better off than our parents. All right, we're all trying to outcompete our parents and our grandparents. Old people are never considered cool. And so when you see that your parents and your grandparents achieve more in economic terms than you have, or in status terms than you have, then that makes people despair. So what do we want? We don't just want to make money. We want to make more money than our friends and our neighbors and our peers. We don't just want a job. We want a more prestigious job than our peers. We don't just want people to like us. We want people to like us more than they like other people. We don't just want to be educated. We want to have better educational credentials than our competitors. We don't just want to belong to a group. We want our group to be better than other groups. We don't just want to have opinions. We want to have the most interesting opinions, more interesting than other people. We don't just want to be attractive. We want to be more attractive than our rivals. We don't just want to be good. We want to be holier than thou. We don't just want to help the environment. We want to be greener than thou. We don't just want a house. We want a prettier house with a nicer view and a better school district than other people have. Right? So why do we have these kind of icky competitive desires as a product of natural selection? Right? When these desires drive you, right, you are more likely to reproduce than people with less intense, icky, selfish desires, right? We are driven to accumulate physical stuff such as food and territory, social stuff, friends, mates, and we want status and power. And this competition has raged over thousands of generations, and winners leave more descendants than the losers. And we're all descendants of the winners, and we have winning characteristics such as these selfish desires, and we're also incentivized to conceal these truths from ourselves and others so that we can more effectively win.
Changing topics now.
In the Post is very much a highfalutin intellectual kind of meaning, trying to come up with a philosophy of life that is coherent. But there's a different kind of meaning that you might call emotional meaning, the feeling that what you're doing is meaningful. And I think that is very much not has an emotional sense of meaning. I mean, even just raising a family is a meaningful activity. Anyone who has a family will tell you that, you know, trying to raise their kid and have a good relationship with their kid is a meaningful project to undertake. And how I think about the emotional aspect of meaning is basically it's evolution's way of telling you that this activity is in your long-term fitness interests. It might not pay off right now. It might not pay off immediately. It may not pay off at all, but probabilistically and in the long run, it's good to invest in this activity. So, you know, if you think about your biological fitness, it's very straightforward in the case of raising a family. It takes a really long time to rear a child to maturity and to make sure that they're successful and well off and high status and going to give you lots of grandkids. That's a very difficult and long run project that will have lots of setbacks and obstacles and discomforts and pains and conflicts, right?
So what are political ideologies all about? So here are 9 confusing things that American conservatives have believed in the past decade. People should not be so easily offended, but Black Lives Matter is offensive. Nobody deserves a free handout from the government except the country working class white towns in America's heartland. We ought to be more suspicious of foreigners, but less suspicious of Vladimir Putin. People should be allowed to express their political opinions freely in the workplace, but athletes should not be allowed to kneel during the national anthem. One of the biggest problems facing America is violent crime, but not gun violence. People who are poor in America have no one to blame but themselves, unless they are working class white people, in which case they should blame immigration, international trade, and reverse discrimination. The government should not interfere with our personal liberty to own a gun, but it should interfere with our personal liberty to consume pornography. We ought to respect the integrity of the American military, but not the FBI. We should respect authority, except climate scientists, the IRS, the EPA, the CDC, public universities, the national news media, government regulators, Barack Obama when he was president. And here are 9 confusing things that Democrats have believed in the past decade. It's unfair for corporate CEOs to make millions of dollars a year, but it is fair for Hollywood movie stars to make millions of dollars a year. We should not endorse negative stereotypes about a group of people based on their place of birth, unless they're from the American South. Men and women are equal in their talents and abilities, but women are better at empathizing and multitasking. A woman should have the right to do what she wants with her own body, unless she wants to refuse a vaccine, wants to sell a kidney, have sex for money, purchase private health care, drink a large sugary soda. We should do everything we can to protect college students, but not police officers in dangerous communities from feeling unsafe. We should not hold all Muslims responsible for Islamic terror attacks, but we should hold all Trump voters responsible for the killing at Charlottesville. We must stand in solidarity with labor unions, but not police unions. We should believe the sexual assault allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, but not the sexual assault allegations against Joe Biden. We should show empathy and respect to all groups unless they are uneducated, southern, working class, pro-life, devout Christians, business people, white people, men, members of the military, or Republicans.
Any parent will tell you that their kid can be a pain in the ass, and you know, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. So we need some kind of emotional mechanism to help us weather those storms, and see the grand prize on the horizon, which is, you know, rearing a mature and successful family that will give you lots of grandkids. So the emotional sense of meaning is something that evolution has given us to get us to devote to long-term fitness beneficial projects. So raising a family is the most obvious example, but there are other examples. I think committing to a group, an alliance, and bolstering that alliance, making sure, you know, that everyone is committed to the alliance, and purging dissenters and purging traitors from the alliance, and making sure that they gain power and superiority.
Right, you can't have a safe space or a safe nation without walls. Right? Civilization depends upon barriers to entry against people who are undesirable. Right? You can't open up your home to complete strangers without terrible things happening. Right? You have to use appropriate levels of discrimination. So I'm a big fan of Nathaniel Branden, who wrote a lot of books on self-esteem. I'm a big fan of 12-step work. And I'm a big fan of the philosopher Charles Taylor. So I was just kind of curious, how does 12-step work, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, how do the self-esteem teachings of Nathaniel Branden map onto these notions of the buffered versus porous identity? So Nathaniel Branden's core idea is that self-esteem comes from experiencing yourself as competent and worthy. So he ties it to 2 practices. One is self-efficacy, right? That you are confident with your ability to deal with life, and self-respect, right? You feel that you deserve happiness, integrity, and good things. And low self-esteem comes from self-evasion, dishonesty with oneself, and reliance on external approval in place of genuine trust. So when I do this show, I am usually much more in my buffered identity. So the buffered identity is that I can strategically, autonomously navigate reality, as opposed to the porous identity, which understands oneself as being profoundly affected by everything going on around you. So the porous self is the medieval self, the pre-modern, open to demons and spirits, to fate and to cosmic forces. And then the buffered self is the enlightened, modern, enclosed self, the self that experiences itself as autonomous, bounded, and self-sufficient, where you're able to generate your own sense of meaning and morality, that you don't have to depend upon what people outside of you say. So the buffered, modern, enlightened, secular self is buffered against outside powers, but it is highly vulnerable to a sense of emptiness and fragility because you have to continually produce value from within yourself, as opposed to the traditional porous identity where right and wrong, meaning purpose, are outside of you, and your duty in life is to do your duty following and abiding by these external standards. So Nathaniel Branden's perspective on self-esteem sees it as a buffered virtue, right? His model assumes the buffered self because he was highly educated secular man. He sees the individual as responsible for generating his own worth through honesty, through appropriate, accurate levels of awareness, through self-responsibility, and through a rational integrity. So he doesn't appeal to eternal sacred orders. He says the locus of value is inside the self. Now, with every type of identity, there are strong points and weak points. And one of the weak points of this buffered identity is that leaves people feeling hollow and perpetually anxious because you have to continually create your own sense of value. And so Branden's whole project is an attempt to provide tools to stabilize this fragile buffered identity by training yourself to continually create confidence and a sense of inner dignity. So autonomy versus recognition, right? The more I depend on other people to give me recognition and praise, right, the less I'm in my buffered self. So Branden says you should be able to give yourself all the praise that you need. But we are evolutionarily wired to need praise and respect and connection with other people. So Nathaniel Branden says we should live lives that are conscious and autonomous and strategic, and we can make the choices that create a sense of inner worth. And for the philosopher Charles Taylor, he sees this buffered identity as lacking moral depth and detached from these larger transcendent external horizons of meaning. And so Branden tries to fill that vacuum with his secular ethic of self-realization. So Nathaniel Branden sees self-esteem as just universally achievable if only people live by certain practices. And Charles Taylor, the philosopher, says, well, this confidence depends on the cultural plausibility of the buffered self. It's a late modern construction. It's not some kind of timeless truth, and it's simply not going to work very well for many people. So Nathaniel Branden, like the enlightened intellectual, secular intellectual that he was, he sees the buffered condition as a liberation, as autonomous and reasonable. Charles Taylor sees the buffered condition in an ambivalent way. It has some freedom, and there is also a loss of meaning and transcendence. So Nathaniel Branden's self-esteem teachings are a manual for how to live in a buffered identity without collapsing, right? They presuppose the buffered self as the best type of identity, and they try to give it psychological ballast. Charles Taylor is much more diagnostic and historicist. He shows how the framework that makes Nathaniel Branden's ideas intelligible is itself a product of a particular time and place.
And dominance over rival alliances. That is also a long-term project that is often beset with many setbacks and obstacles. And I think many people gain a lot of meaning from their political.
And Claire says, look forward, where do you, a convert to Judaism, admire atheist intellectuals? So I admire truth from any source.
Allegiances. And that can be either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you want to look at it. Cultivating a valuable skill is also a long-term thing. That will pay off in terms of raising your status, but may be beset with obstacles. Helping others, putting others in your debt, that might pay off in the long run. If you're ever in need, then you'll have a lot of people who feel grateful for you and are willing to help you.
Right. One reason that I spent so much time volunteering over the past decade is that I want other people to think well of me and to come to my aid if I need aid.
In that situation, but in order to be helped in that situation, you must have provided a lot of help to others before that, and so that's why helping others feels meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
So that's emotional meaning. Sorry, I went on a very long tangent there.
No, that's fine. That's great. So
yeah, what our actual reasons are for living and caring for families and supporting our political tribe. That is very much unique to intellectuals, at least in my personal experience. I could be wrong. I'm happy to see some data.
I didn't really understand the significance of Charlie Kirk when he was alive because I just didn't find his way of speaking particularly impressive. I needed Mark Halperin to break it down and explain it to me. Let me know if I've already played this clip, but I think Halperin is absolutely masterful there.
About what it means more broadly, and talking to a lot of people in the conservative movement who can explain this so well. MAGA folks who I've talked to in the last few days, reflecting on Charlie's life and why this has been so impactful. You hear about the impact not just from the president and the vice president and people who knew Charlie personally, but I've been struck on two-way and other conversations as I've traveled the last few days, how much people who never knew Charlie and weren't even particularly aware of what his day-to-day activities were, how much they've been struck by this. Now, part of it is just the horror of what happened and the horrible images of his murder that resonate with any human being. But a lot of it is for people in this country who supported President Trump, even in many cases, when they didn't like him. Why? Why is it so powerful? I think Charlie, biographically and in terms of what he did in his career, has so many of the elements that have caused the MAGA movement to grow. Donald Trump, it's often been said, didn't lead this movement so much as figure out was there and get to the front of the line, front of the parade, and lead folks, organize folks. What's happened here, I believe, is that Charlie's life, Charlie's biography, is so resonant with folks because of the strands that it represents. For decades, conservatives in this country have felt aggrieved, alienated, shut out from so much of what is sometimes called the mainstream, because liberal institutions, the media, universities, big corporations in many cases, Hollywood, news, and so many of the big institutions have not just alienated people on the right, but often hurt them, kept them from job advancement, kept them from having rewarded time in college, kept them from getting fair media coverage if they were in politics. Charlie represented so many of the themes, so many of the specifics that people in MAGA have reacted against, and his death, his murder, has made them feel like one of their champions, one of their great success stories was eliminated as a symbolic pushing back, regardless of who actually pulled the trigger. Charlie was not in his life given credit by the establishment that he should have been. Had Charlie Kirk been a Democrat and done what he done in service of, say, Barack Obama, he would have been one of the most feted, celebrated, profiled, championed people in America. Now, Charlie got plenty of credit in certain circles. This program certainly paid respect to what an extraordinary life he had. But he was not treated the way he would have been a Democrat. So what are these themes? What are these elements of Charlie's life that the establishment, the liberal establishment in particular, did not celebrate, did not feel a closeness to? I'd start with his education. Not only did Charlie not go to an Ivy League school or some other fancy school, Charlie didn't graduate from college. And the establishment, again, the liberal establishment, I'll use them interchangeably, they don't respect that. They don't like that. They don't identify with that. So for a lot of folks who knew Charlie's story, the fact that he was so successful running a $100 million company, friends with presidents, vice presidents, other leaders, didn't graduate from college, rubbed some people the wrong way, kept him from being seen the way he should have been seen. And for people in this country, less educated, of course, a huge reason Donald Trump was elected president twice and almost won a third time was that education divide, right? There's no more important demographic divide in America now between red and blue than education. President Trump, historically, you see it in the polls today, does better with less educated voters. And Charlie represented that, got a life education in the real world, but didn't graduate from college. Next, religion, right? The Democratic Party has become the secular party, and this is not a subjective judgment. The polls show it. Charlie wore his faith on his sleeve. Charlie had Jesus Christ as his savior, and Charlie didn't shy away from that. He didn't pull his punches. When he spoke in secular locations, like in some universities, he didn't hide from it. He didn't shy away from it, nor did he judge others because of it.
So 50 years ago, Christians were evenly divided in America between the two political parties. It's just in the last 10 years that they have overwhelmingly become Republican voters.
But by being a man of faith, by saying, I am doing this to make the world a better place, to do the Lord's work here on earth, the liberal establishment doesn't get that. They don't identify that. And the fact that Charlie was religious and that kept him from achieving the approval of people on the left.
And Claire says that David Pinsof is an amoral nihilist. Well, it doesn't really matter if he's saying something that's true.
Again, that's a theme that you hear time and again from religious conservatives. You see it in the fights over school curriculum. You see them for some more fights that occurred around COVID. People of faith are not treated the same by the liberal establishment. They're looked down on, they're scorned, they're discriminated against. Charlie rose above that, but that theme very resonant, and he was well aware of his ability to.
Right, I didn't understand these points as clearly until Mark Halperin made them. I think this is just a masterful monologue. So let's talk about the world of meaning in the porous identity. So in a porous world, the pre-modern world, the medieval world, in the religious world, in the traditional world, we as individuals are not sealed off from other people, right? Meaning, value, morality, danger, all good things flow through us from the outside, whether they're spirits, fate, God, demons, ancestors. Our worth is largely received. It's not internally generated. It is bestowed upon us by our community, our ancestors, our tribe, our faith, our sense of the cosmic order. Our self-esteem is not some kind of standalone, internally generated psychological achievement, right? It is a reflection of our ability to accord with the standards that are external to us, and to live up to these standards with grace, honor, purity, in alignment with the divine. So Nathaniel Branden says your self-esteem depends on how honestly you live with yourself, how much integrity and consciousness you bring to your choices, right? A traditional identity, a religious identity, a porous identity finds this odd and alien. It doesn't see us as manufacturing our own worth internally within our own minds. Our worth is mediated through our participation in larger orders, sacraments, rituals, caste, tribe, honor systems. Fragility versus security. So for the Buffett identity, the risk to one's self-esteem comes from self-doubt, alienation, inner collapse if you don't live up to your own standards. From the perspective of the porous identity, greatest risks are from being invaded or cursed, falling out of alignment with God or the tribe or your ancestors, falling out of harmony with the cosmos, spiritual forces, community, right? Self-esteem is not something you shore up with daily practices of consciousness, right? Self-esteem is something that is always vulnerable to the external disorder, and so you work together with your in-group to create a more harmonious community. Right, so from Nathaniel Branden's perspective, from the secular perspective, what matters most is your own self-regard. From the traditional perspective, right, recognition, right and wrong, meaning, purpose, external legitimation by God, king, elders, spirits, that's what matters most, right? This external legitimation. So from the traditional perspective, the self-esteem advocated by Nathaniel Branden is unintelligible without an anchor in external validation from God, tribe, religion, the community, your ancestors. So Nathaniel Branden's practices of living consciously, responsibly, with integrity, these are all self-generated, chosen principles. Porous self sees these as thin. Morality is not invented. It is received from the outside, from God, from the community. And to imagine that your own self-esteem arises from your own self-created principles is presumptuous, if not blasphemous. So Nathaniel Branden provides a toolkit to stabilize the autonomy of the Buffett and to keep the Buffett from collapsing inward. From the traditional religious porous model, right, his model seems incoherent. Self-esteem is not something you cultivate privately. It's something that you inherit or receive from your living up to obligations outside of yourself, from your recognition of your proper place in the cosmic and social order.
To use that to his advantage to rally people of faith around him. He lived in Arizona. There's another example of the bias. Great place, love it in Arizona, but the East Coast liberal media establishment, they just don't credit people achieving things that aren't in the bi-coastal space. Charlie also achieved his success without the help of the left. And you look at all the great things that have risen up, and again, Donald Trump, Exhibit A, all the extraordinary stories of success from MAGA. Charlie and the president, first and foremost, I would say, as you know, president, getting elected president, bigger deal. But to develop that kind of power, that kind of following, without the help of the left, going around the liberal media, not needing the money of people on the left, not needing the help from universities or Hollywood. Establishment doesn't like that. It's a threat to their power. Charlie's success occurring that way really undermined people on the left, and it's a great source of inspiration to people in MAGA, right?
So from Charles Taylor's perspective, the very intensity of today's fights around self-worth, empowerment, and fragility shows how precarious the buff itself is. And Nathaniel Branden's system is just another attempt to patch the hole. It's a rationalization of this ethic of self-esteem being generated. And so for the buffered, the educated, the secular, this fragility is an inside problem. And the solution is to build up your inside principles and take responsibility for your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, and your actions. Right? You don't demand that your community, your tribe, the world protect you. You build inner resilience. From a traditional perspective, harm and danger can constantly invade us from the outside, whether in the form of words, images, environment. So protection, creation of safe space, and restricting speech, right, makes sense because our worth is not internally generated. It is preserved by shaping our communal environment. So from the modern secular Nathaniel Branden approach, true self-esteem comes from honesty with oneself, not from conforming to external scripts. Man with inner-directed self-esteem does not need dominance games. He can just live with integrity. From a traditional framework, masculinity is sustained by these external codes of honor, ritual, recognition. Losing these external moral frameworks means losing your identity. Nathaniel Branden is the intellectual father of the self-love, self-esteem therapy talk culture about affirmation, self-acceptance, inner dialogue. It's all aimed at trying to stabilize the self against emptiness. From a traditional perspective, this feels hollow, right? You don't make yourself lovable, God does, or your family does, or your tribe does, or your nation's honor does. So from a trad perspective, this self-love without an external anchor seems narcissistic because value should come from outside the self. So therapy culture, liberal elites believe that we should build our own inner ballast. Right? The traditional see this as delusional self-construction. It is a buffered fantasy of autonomy. Our fragility is not fixed by internal work, but by restoring external structures of meaning in faith, family, tribe, order. So the culture wars about mental health are really battles over which self is the best, right? For Nathaniel Branden, he is the guru of the buffered self. Now, we all oscillate between porous and buffered identity. When you go to work, you'll usually have many incentives to take on buffered identity. When I do this show, I usually have more incentives to inhabit a buffered perspective on life. When we leave work, that's when we tend to slip back into our porous traditional religious identity. So we all have situations where we're incentivized to take on one identity or another. When we're interacting with strangers, usually there will be more incentives to take on the buffered identity. So even when we take on the buffered identity, we do not get to escape the reality of the porous, right? The buffered self is a creation of modernity, but it is always haunted and vulnerable by the essential porous nature of life. So the more secular you are, the more educated you are, the more you will take on the buffered identity and assume that the inner self is autonomous, bounded, rational, and responsible for generating its own meaning. The more traditional you are and the more religious you are, the more you understand the self as porous. But even secular people can revert to porous thinking in certain contexts, bad vibes, bad energy, feeling attacked by words, right? So in the therapeutic revolution, right, it's all about pushing the buffered self, but we constantly see the porous nature of reality washing in the terms of fundamentalist religion, yoga talk, conspiracy culture, demons, the deep state, wellness, spirituality, chakras, astrology. So the groups that are the most buffered, right, they valorize autonomy, self-construction, and resilience. The groups that are the most porous, the religious, the populist, the traditional, they valorize protection, divine order, and recognition within the tribe. So at work and at school, we're incentivized to be more in our buffered identity. right? That identity receives more rewards for taking on self-control, autonomy, and objectivity to solve problems with reason. Don't talk about demons and supernatural causation. Don't admit to porous experiences such as the room feels haunted. The more anonymous, the more impersonal your interactions, the more you are incentivized to take on the Buffett identity, right? You cannot assume shared sacred meaning, so you stick to that which is neutral and bounded: contracts, rights, preferences, data. Think of customer service, legal disputes, dealing with bureaucracies, right? The whole machinery of our modern institutions assumes the Buffett self, right? If you show porous reasoning in a secular professional context, such as "God told me this is true," you will lose status and authority. Buffett scripts cut down on ambiguity. Everything is reduced to internal choices and external rules. In elite educated circles, being Buffett is high status, shows that you are rational, mature, and cosmopolitan. But in our intimate lives with our family, friends, religion, community, right, the porous nature of reality floods back in. People pray, people share their dreams, they talk about vibes, they rely on rituals. So the modern condition will incentivize different forms of identity in different contexts.
Charlie started a popular show, a popular video podcast. He didn't need CBS News or NBC News or the New York Times to help him do that. That ability was a great source of pride for Charlie, great source of pride for his followers. But again, it's another way in which here's a guy, rises up, develops a successful show on his own, and then he's eliminated. Okay. Another one, related, Charlie was not chummy with the establishment media. He was respectful to them. And you can find probably as much for Charlie as any leading MAGA figure, you will find lots of liberal reporters who had dealings with him, who he was friendly with, who he was often agreed to do interviews with, sometimes surprised me. But he didn't need them. And he didn't really associate with them. He did not, there's some people, even some conservatives, who will fly to Washington, D.C. or New York and do editorial boards or go out to dinner with reporters. Charlie didn't do that much because he didn't need to. And he didn't really want to. He'd rather be home with his family and long flight from Arizona. But that's different. And the fact that someone, without being chummy with the establishment.
So many people, such as myself, who generally align with a traditional porous understanding of identity, find great deal of wisdom and benefit from the Buffett identity in certain situations and from the Nathaniel Branden teachings on self-esteem, right? His ethic of responsibility, his insistence that self-esteem grows from living consciously, responsibly, and with integrity, right? That's not foreign to a traditional perspective on life. Even if you have traditional views on life, you understand that in certain circumstances, certain situations, that the Buffett identity is a useful tool. You can recognize that while your tradition gives you all sorts of external anchors, right, modern life also demands inner ballast. And how do you operate when your traditional anchors of reality and meaning are not recognized by the people around you? So most people move in and out of different forms of identity. Now, most conversations about emotional sobriety, and I've been listening to a lot of 12-step talks on emotional sobriety in the last couple of years, right, assumes that the Buffett self is the ideal self. But then it often borrows from porous practices such as prayer, meditation, and recognition of the importance of community to support that Buffett identity. So 12-step work, right, have many things in common with each form of identity. It is both a critique of the naive Buffett self, noting that self will run riot doesn't work. So it builds a chastened, disciplined Buffett identity anchored by a porous horizon, higher power, God. So the path of recovery, the path of 12-step work, the path of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is a hybrid. It valorizes bounded agency, self-regulation, and responsibility. So in the first 3 steps, when you admit powerlessness and you recognize you need help and you turn your will and your life over to the power of God, this is a porous connection to the overly Buffett self, right? You relinquish sovereign self-rule, you resituate yourself as living under external God power, and you puncture your feelings of being omnipotent and autonomous. In steps 4 through 7, where you do a moral inventory, where you admit your wrongs, where you become ready to make amends and you humbly ask for guidance, right? These are buffered skills training, right? You have radical self-examination, you develop the skills of truth-telling, you notice your character defects, you become willing to change, right? Here you're developing an inner locus of control for meaning, reaction, and habits. But the humbly ask component, right, keeps this buffered self in check by recognition the reality of external God. Steps 8 through 10, where you become ready to make amends, you make amends and you carry on a daily moral inventory. And when you're wrong, you promptly admit it. Right? This is a way of living in buffered responsibility in the social world. You own the consequences of your choices. You try to repair relationships, and you operate with a continuous feedback loop. Step 10 of constant monitoring and course correction. So this is classic buffered self-governance. But step 11 is all about prayer and meditation. These are porous practices that are used to stabilize your buffered agency, right? These are tools to discern and align your behavior. And you're warned against using God to reassert your own self-control. And then step 12, carrying the message, living a life of service. This is transforming your buffered identity as a way of serving and helping others. So 12-step recovery uses both the buffered and the porous identity.
Establishment press could succeed and then be eliminated. That's another one that has really inspired people while he was alive and frustrates people now that he has been killed. Threat to their power, right? You think about Charlie, threaten universities' hammerlock hold on their students, going on university campuses and telling conservatives, you don't need to listen to the establishment.
I never did have an alcohol problem or a substance problem. I had certain compulsions, certain maladaptive responses to reality that could be understood as emotional addictions. And I found 12-step work very useful in that regard.
That he stood for, but they're looking at what's happening on the left saying, I don't want anything to do with that. Right? Like, I don't even want to be associated with this vile reaction to something so horrifying. That's, I think, the one thing that they really don't understand, that their side has become so repugnant. They're driving the few people that were aligning with it before away. When I grew up, 70s and 80s, my family were all Democrats. We weren't political, but they were all Democrats. It was like, okay, we were Catholic, so they didn't love that the Democrat Party was pro-abortion, pro-choice, whatever. But they thought Republicans were for rich people. We weren't rich, so we had to vote Democrat. That's pretty much what. Now my mom, who's 84, she looks at them, she's like, oh my God. She doesn't recognize anything. She voted for Trump. She, God willing, will vote Republican again. But I think they're not sufficiently calculating it in. And I also think, Mark, if they did, they still wouldn't change.
I agree. Totally agree.
Well, I'm gonna say that's actually where it gets even worse for them, because as Charlie grew into the man that he was until last week, he had become so popular in the context of evangelizing and bringing people. I mean, Brad Wilcox, who's an expert in trends about marriage, has looked at the data and recently said Charlie Kirk may have been responsible in no small part for encouraging young men, like why we're seeing this movement with young men in terms of marriage. You can also look at young men going back to church. The blind spot that people who are just now coming to understand what Charlie Kirk meant to Gen Z, that's remarkable in and of itself. I mean, if you didn't know about that last Monday, you're completely out of touch with the average, 18 to 29-year-old, actually younger than that, probably
he
14.
was such a good example. Erica said in their, how they met and fell in love video, that he would wake up every morning and say to her, how can I serve you better? He took all this shit because he was on camera saying, women just submit to your husband.
He took some shit from me for that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a jarring comment but for 2025. But I think he didn't mean just go along with everything your husband said.
Yeah.
He meant there are traditional roles and goodness can come if you choose to follow them. It's not, I said this on the air last week, it's not how Doug and I approach our marriage, but there's something beautiful about asking a wife to submit to the husband's needs and desires at some point, and having the husband wake up every day saying, how can I serve you better?
Yeah, it's Ephesians 5. And that's what he was talking about in the clip that I gave him shit for, honestly, because I thought he should have, kept going a little bit deeper into the verse, which Erica has since said is one of his favorite verses, Ephesians 5, which talks not just about the wives submitting, but also about husbands loving their wives as Christ loved the church. It's beautiful. And that is a very positive example that we never saw in popular culture until people like Charlie Kirk broke through.
Mm-hmm. He gave these young men a model for how to date, how to ask a woman out, how to woo her properly, court her, as Charlie said, not just when it comes to paying the tab, but when it comes to actual courtship and being a man and being assertive and being confident and being somebody a woman would be attracted to, right?
But not being Andrew Tate.
But not being Tate. Yeah, exactly right. And then how to be a husband, how to be a loving father, how to prioritize your private life, how to talk about your future goals in a way that's aspirational and directed as opposed to just wandering and
all this
meandering.
Was a huge priority for him and a huge source of his appeal, which again, people who haven't studied him or listened to him don't realize. They just think he was like some Trump flunky.
Mm-hmm. They're going to learn the hard way. I hope you're right about the midterms and beyond. Because I can feel those high school chapters turning into voting Republicans in the next couple of years.
Data challenging me, but it seems like if you poll the general population and you ask them, how much they think about existentialism or nihilism or Camus or Sartre, or how much they care about having a coherent worldview or philosophy, I would bet you that you would see highly educated people answering yes to those questions at a much higher frequency. And so in that sense, I don't think most people care about the meaning of life in that intellectual sense.
Whenever I think about the intellectual
status game, that doesn't mean it's bad. And that doesn't mean it's not useful, and that doesn't mean it's not improving the world in some way. Certainly, we're going to be biased to think that it's useful and that it's improving the world in some way. But just because we're biased to think that doesn't mean it's not true.
So another thing that you wrote about in one of your posts is, and earlier...
morality is not, in fact, nice. It's quite mean. If you think about all of the awful stuff that has happened throughout history, it has all had a very high-minded moral justification. Purges, pogroms, inquisitions, genocides, eugenics, conquests, colonialization.
So a conversation in the chat about Mark Halperin losing his mainstream status when he was Me Too'd about 8 years ago. So I was just reading the most popular, most used textbook on evolutionary psychology, and it notes that women are most upset about sexual harassment when it comes from men with low status, and they tend to be much less upset when the harassment comes from men with high status.
You name it. It all comes accompanied with a moral justification. We cannot commit injustice without thinking we're pursuing justice. We cannot behave immorally without thinking we're behaving morally. We need our moral justifications and our moral rationalizations in order to effectively mobilize groups against rivals. So that is what I think a lot of morality is about. It's about mobilizing groups against rivals. And the way we do that is by creating self-serving narratives that frame the group as morally superior and the rivals as morally inferior. I think way too much of the scholarly literature on morality takes an overly sunny view of what it's all about. That is, if you think about morality from a Darwinian perspective, ultimately it exists because it helped our ancestors outcompete their rivals. That is, ancestors who had the genes for morality did better, got more stuff than ancestors who didn't have those genes. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how did they get more stuff than their non-moral rivals? Well, there are only so many ways, right? They could either physically exclude them from that stuff, just not interact with them or just avoid them. That's not very nice. They could violently exclude them. They could hurt them or kill them. Not very nice. They could lie to them and to keep them away. That's another tactic. Really, there's no way that one group of primates can get more stuff than another group of primates systematically throughout evolutionary history without being mean to that other group of primates. There's just no way to do it. So I think morality, while it is very much about cooperation, as a lot of scholars have argued, it also must necessarily have a competitive side. That is, there must be some kind of competition at the heart of it. Yes, we cooperate, but we cooperate to outcompete our rivals. Yes, we try to show off our virtue and to be good cooperative partners. But what we're doing there is we're competing with other people to be better cooperative partners than they are. And that is, the virtue signaler does not know that they are a virtue signaler, and neither do the recipients who award them virtue. If they thought of them as virtue signalers, they wouldn't award them virtue. They would think they were, narcissistic or whatever, right? The brave norm violator does not know that they're actually, in fact, just conforming to the norms of their particular subculture, and neither do the members of that subculture. The authentic person who is authentically expressing their true self does not know that they're behaving exactly how society wants them to behave, and neither does the society who praises them as authentic, right? So these are signals being sent that are concealed from both the signaler and the recipient.
And so why is it that things like status seeking and virtue signaling have to occur covertly for them to work?
Yeah, so the answer is kind of complicated. So I think it has to do with a couple cognitive abilities we have. One ability is that we are just eagerly in search of information about a person's character. We are likely to draw all sorts of inferences about them from the subtlest things they say and the subtlest behaviors they engage in. We want to know what kind of person. I want to know what kind of person you are, and I'm going to judge you in all sorts of ways, unconsciously and consciously, and draw inferences. You said this thing, that means that you're this type of person. So that's what I call cue-based inferences, using others' behaviors as a cue to their underlying traits. And then there's recursive mentalizing. So that's the ability to get inside other people's heads and think about what they might be thinking about, or what they might want, or what they might have intended. And the recursive part comes from embedding mental states inside other mental states. So for example, I want you to think that I'm smart, but I don't want you to think that I want you to think that I'm smart. Because if you thought that, you would think I was a douche, right? So that's an example of recursive mentalizing. They're thoughts about thoughts, beliefs about desires about thoughts, beliefs about intentions about thoughts, etc. That's a lot. Apologies. Let me get back to social paradoxes. Why does virtue signaling have to occur covertly? Well, because being an overt virtue signaler, trying to show off your virtue, that's a signal, but it has also at the same time become a cue of one's underlying vanity and self-absorption and selfishness and pettiness, and perhaps even one's low status. Maybe you're insecure about yourself because you're low status and you want to try to show off to improve your status. Whatever the reason, we draw all sorts of negative inferences about people when they overtly and conspicuously show off their virtue. So that means that if we want to gain virtue, we cannot let people know that we're virtue signaling. We have to somehow signal our virtue without making it seem like we're signaling our virtue. And one way of doing that is to hide the fact that we're virtue signaling, not merely from the people we're signaling to, but also from ourselves. That is, we deceive ourselves. We think we're not actually virtue signaling. We're pursuing some high-minded value. And the same story could be told about status. If you're a status seeker, people draw negative inferences about you. You're selfish, you're competitive, maybe you're low status and insecure. We don't like status seekers. So in order to achieve status, we must conceal the fact that we're trying to achieve status. That is, status seeking must occur covertly and must be disguised in high-minded, benevolent terms.
And this will be my last question. I was just about to ask you if this would connect in any way to self-deception, in the sense that if we self-deceive,
and that it makes us more successful at deceiving others if we can deceive ourselves first. Mm-hmm. And I think the general argument here is sound.
I'm thinking about our erotic fantasies, right? When we're engaged in our erotic fantasies, one part of us is in the erotic fantasy, but then the other part is outside of it, and it knows that we're just constructing and imagining this fantasy.
And I think one way I like to frame it is in terms of a lawyer who practices their opening statement to themselves before they deliver it to the jury, right? Maybe they'll practice in front of the mirror, I don't know. But they want to make sure that they'll hear themselves giving the arguments, and if it's convincing to themselves and if it sounds good to themselves, then it probably sounds good to other people. And I think we do that with ourselves. That is, we first try out arguments on ourselves before we.
And one of the greatest things about being connected to other people is that they will call you out, right? They'll let you know when you're off base, when you're engaged in a self-destructive tangent. And the less people are invested in you, right, the less likely they are to deliver that painful criticism.
We try them out on others. And what we're often arguing about is how good we are or how not bad we are. So we first try to convince ourselves that we're good people, that we don't care about status. And we rehearse those arguments in our head. And we sometimes even do things in the world that help us gather evidence for that picture of ourselves. We might actually donate to charity so that later on we can say, hey, I'm not a bad person, I actually donated to charity, right? Yeah. So we convince ourselves through talking to ourselves in our head and making arguments to ourselves in our head and anticipating future scenarios where we might be called out. And we also occasionally act in the world so as to accumulate evidence of our good character that we can use later on if we're ever challenged. That is, we prepare like lawyers for trials that we may not ever be in, but it's good to prepare in any case because those trials could be hugely important for our fitness. That is, if we're caught off guard by an accusation or an insult and we have no argument to give in response.
Right. The power of self-deception is enormous. Let's have a look. Curious Gazelle says, Luke talks about how humans are not driven toward truth, but towards usefulness. It's been a running theme in the depths of my mind. In anthropological terms, truth seems to be a modern European concept. In non-Western cultures, the tendency towards usefulness and status over truth is on steroids. That's why these days I refer to game theorists. Many souls today are caught between the usual binaries of nature versus nurture, rationality versus intuition. Luke talks of the above, but he's mainly caught between truth-seeking versus game theory. Constantly, who will save Luke from his deep conflict? Judaism has been helpful to Luke in that it is a religion that has both truth and usefulness built into it, or is it really? Okay, maybe I can persuade Curious Gazelle to grace my show. So Ricardo tagged me in a post. Let me pull it up here. It's from someone billing himself as a Muslim skeptic, Daniel. And he says, if Jewish IQ is so much higher than the rest of us, why can't Jews beat us fair and square on social media in the marketplace of ideas? Why did they have to resort to using blackmail and other unethical methods to buy and influence the platforms in their favor? And someone says, why do they rely on aggressive personalities, manipulation, money, and strong social networks? The high IQ is a myth, just a bunch of mob tactics. And so this is my response. Number one, anyone who doubts that Ashkenazi IQ is not significantly higher than the 100 IQ average is simply not interested in truth. What does beating mean in social media? Collecting likes and subscriptions from midwits. 3, unethical is in the eye of the behavior. It depends on your hero system. 4, if you're interested in niche construction like every other living thing, why would you not want to own and or control platforms? 5, winners win, losers whine. 6, interesting tweets are rarely true, rarely important. 7, most forms of life go extinct. Acting in your own self-interest and group interest is the best way to not go extinct. Why would you not expect Jews and every single other form of life to act in their own self-interest?
When you communicate anything, people are going to draw inferences about your motivations. And for me, then the question should be, what are the norms that we want in institutions like universities? Right? What are going to be conducive to those universities performing their function. And I take the sort of telos, the function of universities, to be basically kind of epistemic, like to produce knowledge, understanding, truth, and so on. And I think, and even when it comes to like mainstream media, I think similarly, they also have kind of epistemic functions. And I think, you know, there should be a strong presumption against criticizing claims or arguments not based on the kind of merits of those claims or arguments, but because they might be used as ammunition by another political faction.
Mhm.
It seems to me that's, first of all, I think there are going to be such strong motivations to criticize claims and arguments for mundane partisan reasons, which should be frowned upon within the context of science and mainstream media and these other sort of epistemic institutions. And secondly, it just strikes me as a kind of recipe for groupthink and institutional decay. If people can't criticize these institutions without that being criticized because it might give ammunition to the wrong side in a political conflict, that seems like it's not going to be good for those institutions in terms of their function of seeking knowledge and so on. So I haven't fully thought things through. That's my kind of current intuition about these cases. But yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me like what you're saying, Dan, is that the argument that we shouldn't promote ideas that can be weaponized is itself a good argument. It's just that when you apply it to itself, it destroys itself. Right. So the idea that we shouldn't promote ideas that can be weaponized can itself be weaponized, and that we should count on it to be weaponized because we're coalitional primates who have agendas, and if we can defend our coalitions by criticizing any idea that could be conceivably construed as a weapon, then we can just dismiss anything that challenges our coalitional narratives. It's an unsustainable norm that it can be exploited in the same way that allowing anyone to censor speech can be exploited by bad actors who will inevitably censor ideas that interfere with their agendas. This idea that we should only promote ideas that have good consequences and avoid bad consequences, or that cannot be weaponized, like that itself can be weaponized and can be exploited by bad actors to protect cherished narratives. So I think it's another example of how cynicism can be a good thing. When you start thinking at a broader level of what kinds of norms are sustainable given our cynical motives, given that we can count on, coalitional primates like us to abuse and exploit the power to censor or the power to dismiss ideas on the basis of their consequences, given that we know this about us, what are the best norms that are sustainable and that are conducive to producing knowledge and truth? And as soon as we abandon this cynicism,
right, we can change incentives, right? We can restructure incentives to create a better society.
Or apply it selectively to our rivals but not ourselves, then we get into a bad place. And so this is one area where I think cynicism can be a good thing when thinking about the broader social incentives and institutions and norms that we're designing.
So I love this article in the New York Times. Climbing Cringe Mountain with Gen Z, raised online under constant scrutiny. Young adults are leaning into embarrassment as a necessary part of growing up. And so you have these various influencers here talking about haters are always hating from base camp. Now you have to move above and beyond base camp. You have to climb Cringe Mountain. Come on. Why? Here we go. Come on, ladies.
My first Pilates class today is that.
Come on.
What Pilates secretly is apocalypse training. My God. I was working muscles I'm not going to need unless the world is ending. Everyone else is going to be running from the zombies. The Pilates girls are going to squat and pulse. Just squat and pulse. They may not look strong, but I'm telling you, they are mentally strong. It's all up here. The teacher kept saying to us, the aim is to increase time under tension. Do you know how profound that is? The guys who have spent the last 20 years just doing bench, they don't stand a chance. Girls who do Pilates are going to...
Okay, climbing Cringe Mountain. Now, the one part of this New York Times Cringe article that rings false to me is the idea that we can ever or should ever stop caring about what other people think. Right? We're all wired to care desperately what other people think. We're wired to care deeply. Right? Some of us, some of the time, will act like we don't care what people think to make people think that we don't care what they think. Right? We're signaling that we're not signaling. Right? Someone once tweeted, "I had the urge to tweet something a few hours ago. I resisted that urge. It feels good." Right? So the tweeter is patting himself on the back for not tweeting, oblivious to the fact that he was tweeting. Well, there was an article in the New York Magazine where the author proudly declared that she had abandoned the notion of ambition. Right? She was tired of writing these pat, cliched think pieces for likes and retweets, so she wrote a pat think piece for likes and retweets. Now, we all care what people think, but what we can change is which people and how intensely we care, right? Some people are stronger than others at standing up against social opprobrium if what they're standing up for is sufficiently important to them. So if everybody in my chat during a live stream disagrees with me, that's not a strong enough force to silence me. If my every single friend disagrees with me about something and none of them know as much about the topic as I do, right? That's not enough to silence me because I'm playing other games than the popularity game, right? I'm playing the status game. I'm willing to take short-term pain for the long-term gain of being right about something important and try to climb up with more and more status. So I care selectively about what certain people think. I care about what people I respect think. So we all care what others think, but we can all differ in how much weight we give to the judgment of different people and what currency they're willing to pay for it. So we can't escape the game. Every action, every inaction signals something, but we can play different games. But we will never get to graduate from care and concern about what other people think of us. There's a good headline, Learning to Climb Cringe Mountain.
We've entered the fascist era. This is not a drill. You know, first they came for Jimmy Kimmel and I said nothing. All that kind of rhetoric that is going on. It's like, well, where have you been? What do you think you people do when you play games in the popular culture? You try to take the high ground and then you defend the high ground by simultaneously making it impossible for alternate views to get expressed, and by playing footsie with power. Then the game of footsie with power shifts when the political atmosphere shifts and an unconventional countercultural person becomes president of the United States with an entire following that he then puts into his administration that isn't going to play by those rules anymore.
This is such an important point because this is what makes the second Trump administration so unique. It is the first Republican administration to use the machinery set up by progressives over the past century in order to politicize the economy, in order to pursue social objectives through regulation against progressivism. It's never happened before. So when you look at the universities and Trump's crackdown on anti-Semitism in the universities, all of that is based on the contracts between the federal government and the universities containing civil rights language that for decades progressive administrations, Democratic administrations had used to pursue their policy objectives. And Republican administrations, for the most part, not thinking about using it for conservative ends because that wasn't part of the conservative mentality. Now we have this administration that is post-conservative in a lot of ways, and it's basically using the progressive machinery for anti-progressive ends.
Right.
And I think this is important too. It's doing so in a cultural context where it can get away with a lot, because what we've seen since COVID and since the Biden administration, is a larger cultural shift to the right, where, as Eliana says, the actual audiences in these local markets, they're not going to stand for it anymore. Why do they have to listen to Joy Behar for an hour in the morning, insult them, and then Jimmy Kimmel turn this terrible event for MAGA and for the country into somehow MAGA's fault?
Well, they don't. So the classic answer to that would be that you don't watch, and then you'll hurt his ratings. The show will make less money, and eventually it will be canceled because it is inimical to the possibility.
So Matthew Continetti is my favorite daily pundit. All right, this is from Israel Update with Michael Duran and Gadi Taub from September 1st.
That the IDF is supporting a deal that Hamas accepted, but Netanyahu rejected. This is all spin. There is no deal that Hamas accepted except a deal of total surrender, which is a completely prohibitive price for Israel to pay. And there is a whole debate. The press is pushing the line that you just helped them push, that there is a deal to be had and that there is a majority of Israelis who support the deal. And Channel 12, there was a joke about Abu Ubaidah, the Hamas spokesman, going on Hebrew Twitter, that Abu Ubaidah is dead, but Hamas PR are alive and well so long as channels 12 and 13 in Israel keep going. And according to these channels, they conduct constant polls in which the majority of Israelis support ending the war with a hostage deal. These polls are only convincing if you only get these results if you.
So the point is, he talks about how the left wants to shut down various forms of media in Israel that are not left-wing.
You don't tell Israelis what the actual price is for ending the war according to Hamas. You said what Hamas put on the table. Hamas is demanding a total surrender of Israel, a total withdrawal, staying in power, getting money for reconstruction, and most importantly, a UN Security Council resolution.
So the hatred of Netanyahu in Israel by the left is quite similar to the hatred of Donald Trump by the left in America.
Resolution that will forbid Israel to renew the war for I don't know how many years. So whenever you tell Israelis all these details, an overwhelming majority rejects the idea. And so the press is pushing basically a fictive line because the press is an arm of the left. And what it seeks to do is finish this war without victory for two main reasons. One, the left is so deranged in its hatred of Netanyahu, it's like the Trump derangement syndrome, that it is willing to cut the nose to spite the face. It is willing to seriously hurt Israel's interests if that would lead to Netanyahu's fall. And secondly, they hope they're trying to prevent an occupation of Gaza, because that will probably be the nail.
The kennel.
Okay, when your hatred for your country's leader overwhelms your desire for the best interests of your country. So my favorite new topic of the past few weeks has been the case for an American industrial policy, and one thoughtful bloke on this topic is the author Ian Fletcher.
Success on the research side, that the lack of an advanced manufacturing ecosystem has stunted the development of many of these breakthroughs because there hasn't been an industry in which to commercialize them and reap the benefits of further innovation?
Oh, well, you're actually raising a whole other issue there, which is very important. What you've said is that one of the difficulties in commercializing robotics in the United States is that you can't just create an industry in isolation. Industries don't exist in isolation. They depend on what has been called by professors Willie Shee and Gary Pisano at Harvard Business School the industrial commons. That is to say, They rely on all sorts of technologies and skill sets and products and access to the management of companies in supplier and consumer industries that they need to work closely.
Right. No man is an island, and no industry is an island.
With. So if you don't have that rich ecosystem of servo activators and vision sensing systems and all the other things you need to build a robot, it gets harder to develop that in the US. Robotics is actually probably not an industry I would choose to cite as one that is specifically constrained by the lack of an ecosystem, just because cutting edge robotics is so new. I mean, they're only just starting to have commercially available humanoid robots and the Boston Dynamics dog robot and so forth. Where I would say is a better example of the phenomenon that you talked about is actually flat panel displays. You're watching me right now on the flat panel display of a laptop, I would guess, or a desktop monitor. Those displays are not made for civilian purposes at scale in the US. And it's a huge industry. It's a high-tech industry. It's an advanced industry. It's not a cheap labor industry. It's a very advanced manufacturing industry. It's the kind of manufacturing industry that the United States should have and doesn't. When people like me talk about the United States not having as much manufacturing as it ought to have, that doesn't mean that I think we're lacking the kind of garment sweatshops we had in 1900 and that Bangladesh has today. It means that all our flat panel displays are produced in places like Korea and Japan. Now, question is, why doesn't the US manufacture flat panel displays? Well, a bunch of explanations, but one of the big ones is that when flat panel displays started to become manufacturable, there was nobody in the US who had the skills to do it. And the reason for that is the flat panel display developed out of the liquid crystal display industry. There are obviously similarities. You're talking about a very intricate, thin film of electronic stuff on a screen. So the companies that dominated flat panel display, despite the fact that the original technologies were American, and some of the crucial underlying chemistry still comes from American companies. The large-scale manufacturing, the big value added, the big profits, the big employment base, that went to countries where they had already had mass manufacturing of LCDs. And that's where the industrial commons and industry ecosystems really helps or hurts you. And that's one of the problems with purely market-based thinking, because the purely market thinking is if something is a good industry to be in, it'll be profitable, and then American entrepreneurs or existing corporations will see this and they'll enter that industry. Well, there are barriers to that when you're talking about entrenched technological ecosystems and skill sets. And it turns out that there are some very lucrative industries you can't get into as an American because the prerequisites aren't there anymore. So that's where you say there's an industrial policy interest in protecting the vitality of a comprehensive manufacturing ecosystem so that when technologies come along in the future that you can see are going to be very lucrative, that you have that option. Otherwise, you're just going to be watching other people do it.
Right. From the point of view of conventional economics, it doesn't matter if the United States exports poetry, potato chips, or computer chips. But conventional economics doesn't have much to say about many of the most important parts of business, such as the development of technology, the operation of corporations, the nature of winners and losers from international trade. There seems to be much more substantial case to be made for industrial policy than I naively assumed before I started reading on this
It's a
topic.
large amount of time. So how has it been back in Australia? Have you had reverse culture shock? Are you welcomed back by the Australian vibe?
Right, this is Chris Kavanagh, who's from Ireland and lives in Japan. And he's talking to his Decoding the Guru's co-host, the psychologist Matthew Brown, who lives in Rockhampton, which is central Queensland.
How are you settling in?
Back in the bosom of Australianness. Yeah, I did have a bit of reverse culture shock. Things seemed a bit uncanny and weird.
So Matt Brown, visited the United States for 3 months.
When I first got back. I mean, but basic things, like as I was driving to my house, and even my brother's house he lives in a bigger town. It was so dark, Chris. Like I'd never noticed it before, but there was no lights. And I was asking my family, has it always been this dark? And it's just like it's much brighter in San Francisco and New York is what I'm saying.
I like that as insight. Like the world seems a little bit darker in Australia since you've come back. But it's possibly because of the lack of electricity and infrastructure development in the region you live.
I think it's purely, yes, the amount of population. But I've been annoying everyone by telling everyone that I like Americans and American culture is better than Australian culture. Australians do not like to hear that. That annoys them.
I'm sure they don't like it at the minute as well, especially with that's not a super popular opinion at the minute, Matt. You know, like America's not on the ascendancy in the international opinion polling at the minute.
Well, it's never been a popular opinion in Australia. Every now and again, they do these attitudinal surveys, Chris, of Americans do them of other countries. Like, what do people think of Americans? And the Australians have pretty negative attitudes to America. Like we're down there with, I don't know, Turkey, maybe a smidge above North Korea.
How do they feel about Ireland?
No, well, it's a survey not about what they think about Irish. It's about what Irish people think of Americans. I think Irish are probably
it's all
negative.
Wait, nobody asked. But you said an attitudinal survey of Australians, right? No?
Yes.
Yeah, so don't they get asked about Ireland? Why don't they get asked about Ireland?
Oh God, no. This is done by American survey companies. They want to know what other people think of Americans. Obviously, that's really what they care about. Nobody cares what people think.
I bet they like them.
Well, I'm not sure. Anyway, we'll find out. But anyway, the attitude's always pretty low, which is always upsetting to Americans because they're like, "Hey, we like you. Why don't you like us?" And you know, the fact is it's all driven by politics and stuff, you know, like it's driven by media and stuff. And it's also driven by the fact that Australians consume so much American culture that there's this kind of chip on the shoulder thing where they kind of pretend not to like it because it's not cool.
Why don't you consume our culture, you Americans? Right? At least in the case of Ireland, again, not just to mention Ireland, we essentially get credited in a lot of countries with people tracing their roots to us, right? Like, you know, Americans
that's because
like
they
have
do.
Connections.
That's because they
well,
do.
sure, yes, but I mean, as a result, Ireland has an outsized kind of national profile, right? Because lots of other countries are kind of like, yeah, we love Ireland because, you know, 4 generations.
So in this discussion, Matthew Brown, the Australian, says he prefers American culture, which is a very unpopular opinion to have in Australia.
My family, we're living in Kilkenny or whatever.
More of a family hovel, in a bog.
That's right. That kind of thing. Good job. Rather than coming back like I've cemented my hate of the US, that would be a bad outcome, right?
I just think it's funny how everyone is prejudiced against Americans, even Americans. Like everyone I spoke to in America basically had terrible things to say about the country and even worse things to say about any part of America that they didn't live in. So the people from the South didn't like the North, the people from the Midwest didn't like the people who lived on the East or the West Coast, people from the East didn't like the West, and vice versa. Lot of parochialism, lot of anti-American feeling in America.
Amongst Americans. Well, that's interesting. In this era of American exceptionalism, that's kind of nice to know, right? That just everyone's still divided. What a beautiful note to
Not me,
start off
Chris.
this
I think they're great.
Yeah. Well,
But I have a bad, like, I think it's good to criticize your country and be negative about it. Truthfully, like, not doing it in an over the top way, which is, I think, a bit of it's kind of
a bit
what's
cringe.
the word? It's a bit narcissistic or something to sort of be overly, you know what I mean? It's like
have some.
Okay, right. If you're overly negative, that's cringe.
I think it should.
Okay, here we go.
Stuff we covered with Destiny was like there was sketchy stuff, but it all seemed to be rather consensual, and it also seemed to be more in the past. But this is like a recent event, right? So who knows how it will turn out?
Right, they do not approve of Destiny having sex with people that he live streams with. Very big ethical violation.
Knows what will happen. I think Destiny, like all other streamers, will, regardless of this, carry on. But yeah, that is why we are not going to put out the episode on the main feed. But we're also not pretending it didn't happen and like deleting it or that kind of thing. So yeah, all our decisions are available, but that was the one that we thought that was appropriate.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, very good.
Oh, well. All right. Well, after that, let me move on to something which is at least a little bit more lighthearted. It involves Bryan Johnson and Andrew Huberman, two figures, again, that we've covered. It's a clashing of the gurus in the guru night, right? The big swinging balls have come together. And the big swinging Bryans. Sorry. Well, I think it's
a little bit.
Freudian slip. We like the image of the big Bryans that collide in the night. But in this case, these are also, people. Bryan Johnson does spend a lot of time talking about his erections and various other things. So whatever. But so Bryan Johnson, he's the don't die.
So Andrew Huberman is the #1 alternative health podcaster in America. Bryan Johnson's all about living forever.
Guru, we've covered him before, right? Now, he tweeted out a thing about doing a 850-pound leg press, 1 rep, okay? And he tweeted out this little 7-second video of him doing the leg press and talking about how it's top 1% of 18-year-olds, right? This is his whole thing. His metrics are comparable to the strapping young people at the peak of their physical ability. And Huberman responded, awesome, but friends don't let friends do partial reps. Okay? Now, I would regard that as a gentle ribbing, because Andrew Huberman has been at dinner parties with Bryan Johnson, along with the Kardashians. The whole family were there and they took a picture together, right? So these are not enemies, but Bryan Johnson's response, this is what happens when you prick a guru's ego, right? They fucking pop like a well-maintained blood balloon. So he said, Andrew, what I did here is complete a technically accurate, validated biological age measurement according to peer-reviewed science and posted my data publicly. I get you wanting to take a cheap shot and score some likes. However, this reduces your credibility because it shows you favor perception over science. When you made that embarrassing error showing that you don't know how to calculate probabilities, I didn't say anything, as I support you in your efforts to help people generally make better life decisions. You're going to be better off supporting people robustly pursuing science than trying to be liked.
Ooh, that's coming on strong. He took it to 11 straight away, didn't he?
He even referenced the Huberman infamous, if you 20% plus 20%, you're 120% likely to get pregnant, right? So,
dear. But yeah, that is, like, you're correct. Like Andrew Huberman, by the way, another person who is not a stranger to controversy of the moral kind. No. He was in this case, make a friendly bit of banter, friendly bit of engagement. That's clearly what it was and how it should be perceived by any normal person. But yeah, gurus are not normal people, and he saw it as a
public criticism.
Yeah, public criticism. And you don't do that. I mean, this is why, we talked before at the beginning, this sort of disease where they're all so nice to each other all the time. Like always, nothing but positive vibes, just nothing but praise. He's a great person, intelligent person. I believe they mean, be doing their best to improve the world. They all talk like this, perhaps because they all have such incredibly thin skins. And if you deviate from that unadulterated glazing, then you risk a response like that.
Yeah. And, that was a rather harsh response. Huberman responded then. Okay, here's Huberman's response. Shoot. Misunderstanding of intent. It was genuine, friendly encouragement. What I would have said if we were training side by side. It's important that we use full range of motion. It was not meant to be a jab. Hence, awesome, but in any case, hope to catch up in person soon. Oh, and that probable...
Oh, come on. Great. Just as I'm playing it, it crashes. Man, I'm trying to run high quality show here. Bloody playback crashed on me. Here we go, mate. What have I got? Some more supplementary materials from Decoding the Gurus. Don't crash on me, bro.
As we scientists say, Joe Rogan is an N of one. Like, hang on, that's not something scientists say.
Matt, it was an N. We talk about sample sizes, right? It's an N of one. It's like if you say regression, like Jordan Peterson has talked about regressions. That base, but he is trying
to
centers of the brain, which make us, when we eat something that has a high essential amino acid content, like a steak, like a really tasty steak, the neurons in the gut, in a way that is independent of taste, are signaling to the brain, I'm getting essential amino acids. You should eat more of this thing. If those, let's just say a small fraction of those amino acids that are present in a candy bar or in a package of Skittles, which I'm guessing there's very few of them, if any, you're going to continue to forage for food because those neurons will also respond to sugar. Basically, it will keep you eating until you get enough of those amino acids. In other words, there are two parallel tracks, one within our taste system.
Multiple pathways to satiation.
Right. They're totally right. Multiple pathways to satiation, one dependent on taste, one dependent on actual nutrient content. The mouth can only learn taste association. The mouth can't actually learn nutrient content. The gut knows nutrient content. The problem is you take a food that is low in a micronutrient or macronutrient or essential amino acids or essential fatty acids. After all, there are no essential carbohydrates. There are only essential amino acids and essential fatty acids.
Right.
And it will keep you eating, and it will keep the appetite system revving until you get enough of those. Now, here's the issue. If you've ever done this,
So
it's
that's
probably been
empty calories.
empty
so to speak.
calories.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's working towards amino acids and therefore meat.
Yeah, well, so he wants to say that, like, if you eat, he kind of does it wrong there because he says that you get a signal, your brain says, like, you need to eat more of this if you eat a tasty steak, right? So that would suggest that you're going to overgorge. But what he wants to say is, like,
the neurons in your stomach are sensing, there were lots of amino acids in that. I can stop eating now because I've got enough amino acids.
It's perfectly calibrated. But if you're eating Skittles, you're going to just keep foraging. You're just going to keep foraging for more and more Skittles because it's not going to satiate you. So someone like Jordan or the carnivores, right? They are onto something here, Matt, because they've worked out, the best kind of food to send you the right signals. And so actually what Jordan is doing is like high level neurobiology, with his highly restrictive diet.
So this thing from Huberman, was that in response to Jordan Peterson talking about meat, or was it all a bit implied or inferred?
Oh, well, it goes on. So let's see, you be the judge. Here's them talking explicitly about steaks.
Right, and I would venture in a very different domain that if you were to eat your steaks slathered in barbecue sauce for a couple of weeks, going back to the way that you eat them now, which, by the way, this is a great opportunity to educate people about something that you taught me when we had dinner last, which is that if you're going to order a steak, order a Pittsburgh char. The char on the outside is incredibly tasty. We love that, the umami taste. We should have a devoted taste receptor to that.
It's complex.
Yeah. So, and if they don't know what a Pittsburgh char is, then maybe you're in the wrong restaurant or you need to educate them. But incredibly satiating, delicious, right? But if you were to slather those steaks in a bunch of things, I would suspect that after a while, your plain steaks wouldn't taste as good.
Oh,
but,
certainly.
But the way to make them taste good again would be to eat them plain for a period of time in which the stuff, all the condiments, et cetera, would start to become aversive. I do believe that when we return to the sort of most naturally satisfying mode of engaging with these circuits, here we're talking about food and sex in parallel, that they become especially satiating. And I think that, in hearing from all these people that are addicted to pornography,
I can imagine where it goes from there. You need to have properly satiating sex, like Huberman does, presumably, with his
you might need a lot of partners.
Yeah.
But and also tomato steaks, no sauce,
no condiments. It's just going to ruin them. You have to get back to the raw. This is paleo diet stuff, right?
Yeah.
You don't want the sauces. You don't want any of that stuff. You just want it cooked on a fire like a caveman. But presumably Huberman's still down with the vegetables and some carbohydrates. He's not all in on the
Not
meat.
yet. But your gut brain will detect what.
So gurus love to give advice even when they don't have a clue what they're talking about, and even when their own track record is incredibly messed
Do
up.
you detect any dissent going on between these characters? Then we know who's to blame, don't we? Brett knows.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Leviathan is going to stump on the scales, trying to cause dissent to distract people away from making America healthy again or something.
Yeah, so there's also a claim that Peterson makes that like left-wing people won't talk to them, right?
A group of us 7 years ago, put out an offer to the Democratic powers that be to invite the Democrats to come and talk to us. Rubin was part of that. Rogan was part of that, if I remember correctly. I'm quite certain of it. I was part of that. Shapiro was part of that. This was a genuine invitation, which was extended many times in serious ways by people who are very well connected among the Democratic elite. And that came to nothing.
They wanted no part of it.
Nope, they'd speak to me, for example, privately, never publicly, virtually never, almost without exception. All the while, the alternative media was gaining more and more power. All the while, we were telling them, this isn't optional. Your legacy media foothold is dying. Wake up.
And one response to that is, I wonder why. I wonder why, given how unhinged your rants are about even mild liberalism. But on the other side of that is that, as we talked about, he just has a long grievance-mongering litany of people that have mistreated him, left-wing people. He presents Helen Lewis like, the incarnation of the evil, most extreme form of the left, and you're like, no, she's like a center left person. So just suppose that they really want to engage with left-wing people, but it's only, the right-wing Nigel Farage types and Tommy Robinson that actually seem to want to appear with them. I don't know if I buy that, but in any case, here's how this interview ends, with self-indulgent praise of how much people like you and shout outs to some other people in the guru sphere.
Of course.
There isn't anything better that can happen to you than to travel around the world and have perfect strangers come up to you as friends and tell you that their lives are far better than they would have been because of their efforts and because of their encounter with what you've been doing. Like, if you could pray for anything to happen to you, there's not a possibility that you could come up with a better wish than that. And so it's great. It's great. And it's fascinating to explore its continuation and to observe the consequences. And it's a privilege to be in it. It's an immense, what would you say? It's unspeakably immense privilege to be in that position. And it's so great to see people like you and Friedman and Chris Williamson and all these other podcasters who are pursuing the same vision and so successfully, and to see the massive effect that's having on people. That's such a good deal. So, and I do believe it's the sort of thing that's in a deeply personalized way available to anyone who follows their calling and conscience.
Wow. Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
Did
yeah.
people tell you, Matt, when they met you, that their life was dramatically better because of coming across you, and that, you know, you fundamentally changed them as a human?
That would be overstating it, definitely.
Yeah, there are certain people who get absolutely intoxicated at the notion that they've changed your life. I remember I just intuitively have this sense that if you tell certain gurus or rabbis, oh, you changed my life, it just absolutely makes them drunk. For Dennis Prager, it's like the sweetest words he can ever hear is someone to praise him as like, oh, you changed my life.
Society is crumbling. People are
the
constantly
right time
kissing. I
spent.
think belly laughs. Belly laughs. And
Refinery. Well, that's probably the most insulting thing about the entire thing. The fact that he referred to all of them as comedians, implying that they were funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there is an incredible amount of back scratching going on here.
Back scratching, Matt. No. So I've just got another clip for you. So, you know the tech billionaire Mark Andreessen, somebody who goes on Rogan, is a bit like David Sachs, right? Just somebody online opinionating, often saying stupid nonsense and getting called on it. But he's a billionaire, Matt. So that makes what he's saying very important. And Huberman just wants to give him a shout out because, you know, he made him famous.
There was a recent post on X that just held my gaze, my attention, where it was a back and forth debate, a pseudo political social debate, and then there were three words that I'll just say that Mark Andreessen said, you know, it was about restoring vigor, pride, and achievement. And I thought, wow, like, he's not a political candidate, but that's a beautiful trifecta: vigor, pride, and achievement. To celebrate those, and I put that next to, you know, the deep pleasure in generative action at a distance, a technological development, the rockets, and there are other
I think
generative
that's exactly
achievements.
the theme of the story of Abraham. It's like the highest form of potential satiation is risky romantic adventure. It's not satiation.
Vigor, what was it?
Pride and achievement.
Vigor, pride, and achievement in a Christian nation.
It could be. They should add Mullerland to the respect of the.
But what? Let's go straight for fatherland, there, Chris. Why not?
Yeah. God damn. And again, Matt, the fucking sense maker worship of words, right? He said 3 words that just got me spinning.
Yeah. I like how he doesn't just read a tweet. He beheld a tweet that held his gaze.
Yeah. And he stopped. He was walking across the room and what the hell is that?
Oh my gosh. They're such pretentious pricks. But the subtext of all of this, Chris, I mean, on one hand, it's sense maker, self-congratulatory bullshit. On the other hand, I mean, this is that thing that we talked about when we covered Jordan Peterson originally, and we called him an accidental fascist, because they have a deep, I think they're reinventing the concept of fascism, you know, this idea of masculine, manly, you know, rediscovering our, you know, genuine values. Like, it's underneath this punchy veneer of, you know, health and optimization and spirituality.
All right, I think this is a big stretch to see in these traditional sentiments evidence of fascism. Right, I find decoding the guru's critique here silly.
But I mean, the undertones are there. It's
yeah. Well, Matt, you also heard, combined with that concerning tendency, we've heard shout outs to Dave Rubin, Lex Friedman, Konstantin Kisin, Stephen Crowder, Joe Rogan. Oh, Joe Rogan. That's right. More.
They're talking about a restructuring of the Democratic Party. Who's going to lead? Who's going to be their Joe Rogan? Which is, by the way, a silly.
Oh man! And once again, just as we get to the good stuff, right? The bloody my bloody tech craps out. Come on, mate, get me back there. This is from Decoding the Gurus. Wait, 71.
Konstantin Kisin, I think, belly laughs.
Okay.
We called him an accidental fascist.
You
Joe didn't emerge by accident. Joe is very, very, very smart. Very. And if you think, and it's what? It's like Joe built this? It's like not the way that a political party would build it. First of all, he didn't build it. Not that way, not through a priori planning so that the Democrats could have a
Right, flattering the people with high listenership.
voice.
It's just him being him.
Very, very, very smart, man. Very, 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 very smart.
Very smart. Incredibly smart. Incredibly smart. Anyone listening to Joe Rogan, listening to him goggle-eyed, listen to the whatever conspiracy theory is floating across his case, talking about the moon landing hoax. The first thing that you think is that what a smart guy, incredibly
Discerning.
smart and discerning. But I mean, the other trend, as well as the Christianization of the gurus, is this coalescing. They all tag each other in so much.
Yeah, they're all discovering Christianity. They're all discovering the world of the demons. Right, so I think there's a pretty sharp left-wing critiques. Wait. Come on, mate. What do we got here? Trying to run a show here, mate. Let's get going. This is another excerpt from Decoding the Gurus.
I'm taking it. But
You can tell me. Email me.
Email Chris. Tell him he'll just.
I think that when Trump lies, it's just not as bad to me personally. So you can't do that and do the claim of, well, it's not about me. It's not about so I think his manager wants to have, understandably, a conversation with Sam where he presents his opinions.
All right, this is a conversation here about Sam Harris and his manager.
As well, and get Sam to respond to them. But he doesn't want to own that is his opinion. So that's my issue. And the one other caveat that I'll add, Matt, is don't add me in your anti-social media crusade. You and Jonathan Haidt, I think the evidence about the effects of social media is much more mixed. I'm not on a Sam Harris anti-social media destroy society crusade. I don't agree with that. So yeah, don't invoke the Royal Podcast on my behalf for that.
No, I know. But I think what they're speaking to is not that if you use TikTok or something, it's going to break your brain, but rather the modern secular zeitgeist is one which continues the modernity, which is a sense of individualism and self-reliance, right? Economically self-reliant.
So the modern educated identity is the buffered individualist identity, as opposed to most traditional forms of identity are much more collective.
And to a large degree, socially self-reliant. It started with the nuclear family, and then it's kind of gotten smaller from there. That's kind of different from more traditional communities where people were more interrelated and relied on each other a lot more. Now, you don't want to romanticize that kind of setup because there's a lot of awful things about living in a tiny little village where everyone knows your business and stuff. There's a reason why we don't want to be hanging out with our next door neighbors every single day. But, I was just making this.
So the two hosts of Decoding the Gurus, I believe they're both married to Japanese women. They both have several kids each.
Soft point that it's okay to talk about these things.
It's fine to talk about it. I just don't like people presenting themselves as not doing something and then doing it, right? The kind of strategic disclaimer approach. And I will also say that in response to your, just asking questions, stimulus, Matt, that it is also the case, however, that while you're right about the fraying of extended family networks and kinship communities and whatnot, we've also seen the flourishing of various digital communities and people building communities around shared interests in sports or these kind of things. And there are all sorts of things.
Cooking and baking, for instance.
Cooking and baking groups online, whatever the case might be. But so I think you have to deal with all of it. And there's a lot of cherry picking that goes on when people want to make a polemical case around this. But it certainly is the case with modernity overall, that there has been a contraction of in-person physical networks. But the internet in so many ways opened, the reason it's called social media, social networks, is because that's what people are mostly spending their time doing, social interactions online. And that is social interactions, whether or not you like it.
I'm on board. I was just asking questions, Chris. I was just standing in for a point of view.
I was speaking to whoever happens to be, floating
That's
around in
right.
ideas.
If you voice a contrarian opinion to Chris, he will not let you take that point of view.
Am I not allowed? Look, hold on. You gotta. I
agree with you.
I'm gonna respond here because there's this tactic, but I'm not saying you do it. Okay, I'm just talking about a general person.
General people. Okay.
Yeah, it's just a general person where they do this thing where they say, okay, well, I'm going to make a counterpoint, right? And there is a counterpoint, and then you say, well, but no, I see that counterpoint, but here's the point, and then they say, oh well, nobody can disagree with you. That's just but by raising the counterpoint, you are making. Oh, not you. Sorry.
Okay, let me fast forward here.
It's based around
and people make out that you're just asking questions and you don't really think that. Yeah,
I know. That's the issue. See, Matt,
it's annoying when people just pose under just asking questions rather than being fair dinkum about where they stand.
Restored accord to the podcast. We're back in simpatico. It's all right. You can disagree vigorously, and in return, it's okay. It's all right. Now, the next clip. So this is still talking about Sam's upcoming appearance with Jordan Peterson, and it references the atheism debacle, the discussion on Jubilee that we talked about last time. So Sam's manager raises this to him.
If there's no Chewy center of superstition and otherworldliness and expectation of redemption after death, there has to be some magic in there. Otherwise, we're just talking about, who's going to bring the egg salad for the picnic, right? I mean, it's like can we figure out some other way to picnic? It's not just a tailgate. You're tailgating for God here. You're tailgating for eternity. And that's what makes it especially meaningful, right? And Jordan doesn't disavow that. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to talk about with Jordan. It's been a very long time since we've spoken, and I haven't really followed all of his kind of the vagaries of his.
Well, but did you see that clip of him going? Well, we're going to talk about that too in a second. Did you see that clip going around with him on the Jubilee podcast episode where
I saw that it exists? I actually didn't watch. I think I saw. Maybe I caught part of a clip, but I just decided to not pollute my brain with it in advance of my conversation with him. I could see that there was some kind of consensus forming online that he had not acquitted himself well in those conversations.
But do you not want to talk to him about that? I think it'd be very interesting to talk to him about it because he seemed very evasive there.
I just didn't want to prejudice I can't imagine he wants to talk to me about it. Right. And I don't know what I can say to him. I mean, I know how Jordan debates atheists because I've debated him. It would be unsurprising to me that if you stuck 20 atheists in a room with him, it wouldn't go very well. It's not like anyone on his side has good answers to the questions atheists pose. There are no good answers, right? I mean, the atheists, religious people are slow to recognize it, but they're standing on just a mountain of non sequiturs.
And you and I probably agree with, Sam Harris's assessment there of how those debates are likely to go and the logic behind it. But I did just want to note that, so Sam's going to have a conversation with Jordan, right? And this manager's like, well, did you see the recent clips, where he's, engaging in rhetorical techniques and avoiding answering straightforward questions of religion? And Sam's response is he didn't want to pollute his brain with those clips in advance of the conversation. He didn't want to prejudice himself by seeing them. And that strikes me as an odd response. Why would Sam, seeing Jordan behaving evasively and arguing about these things, why would that pollute your brain?
Well, it strikes you as odd because you're the kind of person that listened to 5 hours of the Matthew McConaughey self-help event when I listened to 20 seconds of it and was in intense psychic pain, just like everyone else. So, of course, it would strike you as odd. But I take your point, which is why wouldn't you understand something about the person that you're debating? Why wouldn't you do the research? Why wouldn't you check the details? I also can... Look, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying Sam is doing the right thing here. I'm sure the way that you do it is the right thing to do. But I understand the impulse to not want to.
Okay. let me just respond. I find it
let me
really
see.
hard to have nice dinners or lunches with people. Like, are they normally having conversations that just break down into yelling matches? And, like it's so rare to be able to have a friendly chat with someone if you don't, raise controversial topics with them or you focus on what you agree with. Because I just don't get it, though. It's always presented as if what an achievement and how diagnostic it is that I had a nice conversation with someone interpersonally. And I'm like,
Yeah, not such